chapter 28, the Gospel according to Luke. There is good reason to believe that Luke was the first of the canonical Gospels. This is rendered probable partly by internal evidence. It is compiled from the oldest manuscripts, and partly by the necessity that would exist of having the first Gospel one which would counteract the influence of Marcion. This could best be done through a Gospel which, while differing from his, would not vary from it so much as to be repulsive to his followers. Besides, Marcion, who was a man of learning, had, with much care, compiled the most ancient gospel manuscripts which he could obtain, and the church authorities were under the necessity of using, to a considerable extent, the same materials. According to Schleiermacher, Luke consists of a compilation of at least 33 different manuscripts as follows. I will put this up there and you can look at it, and I'll just procrastinate a couple more seconds and then I will continue on. Some of these divisions may be too artificial and may have been established to maintain some supposed unity of purpose in the gospel historian, but the analysis itself appears to be founded in fact and is in the main pursued in a scientific manner. If now the same process be applied to the Gospel of Marcion, it will be found to consist of a compilation of 26 manuscripts. An analysis of the two Gospels develops the fact that every manuscript after the first 8 of Luke appears in both Gospels. The circumstance favors the theory that one of these Gospels was used in the construction of the other, which was probably the model. Not only is Marcion much the shorter, but its narratives are simpler and more natural than those of Luke. The subject may be illustrated by reference to some of the more important and extensive differences between the two Gospels. The first 3 chapters of Luke were not in Marcion. The first part of the 4th chapter of Luke, which appears in Marcion, is that commencing at verse 16. And he came to Nazareth. This, in Marcion, comes in its regular order after the ministry of Capernaum, while in Luke, Jesus here refers to his doings at Capernaum, though his visit there is not stated until afterward. We find the whole of the 4th chapter of Luke in Marcion substantially, except the first 15 verses. But these 15 verses, together with the preceding chapter, none of which is in Marcion, constitutes altogether, according to Schleiermacher, a single manuscript. The German critic was writing without any reference to Marcion. This coincidence may therefore be considered confirmatory at the same time of the theory of Schleiermacher and of the priority of Marcion. In closing the 4th chapter, the author of Luke, having arranged sufficient preliminary matter, we may suppose that he now took up the Gospel of Marcion, which he found to be a compilation of manuscripts carefully collected, and made it from this point onward the basis of the Gospel according to Luke. Let us see how, upon this supposition, he proceeded with his work. The style is much the same in the additional matter as in that which is common to both Gospels. Changes and additions are found here and there, some having been made for dogmatic reasons, others apparently for no other purpose than to compose a new Gospel. The first edition of much importance is Luke chapter 7, verse 29 to 35. This contains a saying of Christ in which is a reference to John the Baptist. Verse 34, the Son of Man is come, eating and drinking, etc. This Han supposed was omitted by Marcion because the representation of Jesus eating and drinking, etc. was opposed to Marcion's view of the spiritual and ethereal nature of Christ's person. But in the very next verse of Marcion's gospel, Jesus is represented as going into a Pharisee's house and sitting down to meat. Whatever reason existed for adding these verses in Luke, we can see no reason for omitting them in Marcion. 2. The next place where there is a difference of several verses entire is Luke 11, verses 6, 7, and 8. This is a mere amplification of verse 5, which in a condensed form is in Marcion. 3. Luke 11, 30, 31, and 32. These verses relate to Jonas, whose name had been inserted in the 29th verse. In Marcion, the reading is, "This is an evil generation. They seek a sign, and no sign shall be given it." In Luke, no sign shall be given it, but the sign of Jonas the prophet. The following 3 verses explain in what manner the preaching of Jonas might be regarded as a sign. It is a continuation of the idea, and the whole passage must stand or fall together. 4. Luke 11:49, 50, and 51. This consists of a quotation from an apocryphal book called The Wisdom of God, the quotation of a suspicious character. It contains the statement concerning Zacharias, who perished between the altar and the temple, a statement which, as repeated in Matthew 23 and 35, with the addition of the word son of Barachias, has caused commentators so much trouble. Marcion has no allusion to Zacharias and contains, no doubt, the more ancient form of this passage. Much of the trouble comes from interpolations. The interpolation in Luke led to the worse interpolation in Matthew. 5. Luke 13:1-10 contains the legend concerning Pilate mingling the blood of the Galileans with their sacrifices, also reference to those slain by the falling of the town of Siloam. Also, the parable of the unfruitful fig tree. None of it in Marcion. 6. Luke 13:29-35. This passage is doubtless an interpolation. The portions of it are much disconnected, and the words, "Go ye and tell that fox," referring to Herod, can scarcely be accepted as the language of Jesus. 7. One of the most extensive differences is in the parable of the prodigal son, Luke 15:11-32, no part of which is in Marcion. It is essentially Pauline in spirit, as has been well remarked. There is no reason why so beautiful an illustration of his own views should have been omitted by Marcion. 8. Luke 18:31-34. Jesus predicts to the 12 his suffering, his death, and resurrection. The prediction had already been recorded, Marcion 6:22, Luke 9:22, and there is no reason why it should be repeated. This entire passage in the 18th chapter is probably an interpolation. 9. The last 20 verses of the 19th Luke are entirely wanting in Marcion. The writing upon an ass's colt in an awkward episode, and was probably inserted to set forth the fulfillment of the prophecy in Zach 9:9. Then follows the prediction concerning the destruction of Jerusalem, the other reference in less explicit language to the same event, Luke 13:34-35, is also wanting in Marcion. There is no certainty that the prediction was ever uttered by Christ himself. Justin Martyr, who would have found this prophecy so pertinent to enforce his argument, made no allusion to it. The remainder of this passage appears to have been written to illustrate the fulfillment of the prophecy in Jeremiah 7:11. 10. Luke 29-18, the parable of the vineyard. This is essentially Pauline in spirit and has a manifest application to the preaching of the gospel to the Gentiles after it had been rejected by the Jews. There is no reason why Marcion should have omitted it. 11. Luke 22:16-18. The Paschal Supper has been the cause of much controversy in all ages of the church, and was the occasion of the first exercise of a general jurisdiction by the Church of Rome. Without entering into the controversy, suffice it to say, if, as there is reason to believe, this passage in Luke, This passage in 22d Luke is an interpolation upon Marcion. The question becomes much simplified. The supper described in that chapter appears to have been an ordinary meal, having been eaten the evening before the crucifixion, and yet in verses 16-18 it is referred to as the Passover. 12. Luke 22:28-30. This is a literal application of certain prophecies to Jesus, an application such as the Jews were constantly making, but such as he himself would scarcely have made in the form here presented. 13. Luke 22:35-38. Here, for the first time, Jesus is made to allude to his coming end, and when his disciples told him there were 2 swords, he said, "It is enough." 14. Luke 22:49-51. These are all of the more extended passages in Luke which are not in Marcion's Gospel. This analysis, equally with the one in a former chapter, affords strong evidence that Marcion was first written. There are other considerations indicating a late origin to this gospel. 1. It is expressly stated in the introduction that many gospels had been written before this one. For as much as many have taken in hand to set forth in order a declaration of those things which are most surely believed among us, even as they who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word, delivered unto us, it seemed good to me also, etc. It is the universal conclusion that the author of Luke does not here refer to any of the canonical Gospels. The fact that the other 3 of those Gospels are impliedly excluded by the language used in Luke raises a strong implication that they were not then written. Why would the author refer to many unauthorized Gospels and make no allusion to 3 which were received as authority? It is an opinion quite generally entertained that several Gospels are referred to in Luke which are known to have been written in the 2nd century. Origen considered that the Gospel of the Egyptians and the Gospel of the 12 Apostles of the Hebrews were among the number. Jerome extends the list as follows. The evangelist Luke declares that there were many who wrote Gospels when he says, for as much as many, etc., which being published by various authors gave rise to several heresies. They were such as that according to the Egyptians, and Thomas, and Matthias, and Bartholomew, that of the 12 apostles, and Basilides, and Apelles, and others, which it would be tedious to enumerate. All right, the Gospels of Basilides was written about AD 125 and that of Apelles about 160. Of course, then, according to Jerome, Luke was after 160. Epiphanius says in expounding Luke 1:1, saying, for as much as many have taken in hand, by which he would intimate that there had been many undertakers of the like work. Among them, I suppose, were Cerinthus, Maranthus, and others. Cerinthus flourished and wrote about AD 145, which Epiphanius thinks was before Luke. Venerable Bede, AD 734, agrees with Jerome that the Gospels of Basilides and Apelles were among those referred to in Luke. Erasmus thought the Acts of Pilate or Gospel of Nicodemus was among the number. Jones includes the Gospel of Marcion. All these writers, and thus dating the Gospel of Luke subsequent to those here named, impliedly renounce the theory of its apostolic origin. 2. The discrepancies between this gospel and that according to Matthew have already been pointed out. These differences indicate a late origin for one or both of these gospels and involve in confusion everything connected with the early history of Christ. It is impossible in the present state of the inquiry to name the author of this gospel. Westcott thinks it circulated mostly about Alexandria and Antioch when first published. It may have been written at or near Antioch. In that case, the person to whom it was addressed was probably none other than Theophilus, the writer who afterward, about AD 180, became Bishop of Antioch. Basnage thinks Luke was the first of the canonical Gospels, and there are many reasons for believing he was correct in that opinion. Michaelis did not consider it inspired, nor does the author of this or of either of the canonical Gospels lay any claim to inspiration. Well, I spied that somebody, who will remain nameless, took a notice on my last reading of History of the Christian Religion of the year 200 by Charles B. Waite, 1900. And I figured I'd give him a second helping. 2 in 1 week. This book kicks my butt, but I don't care. It's pretty good. So, happy Thanksgiving. Chapter 29, the Gospel according to Mark. Mark is the shortest of the 4 Gospels. Its brevity is due partly to the omission of the biography of Christ, which is contained in Luke and Matthew, and was probably constructed from the Gospel of Peter as a basis with many changes and the incorporation of new material. If the analysis of Luke be applied to Mark, the following will be the result. The first 7 manuscripts are wanting. MS number 8, Luke 4:16-30, is omitted in Mark entirely, in place of which is inserted the calling of the apostles, Mark 1:16-20. The previous account of the preaching of John, Mark 1:1-8, is so much different from that in Luke that it is plain it was not from the same manuscript. Number 9, Luke 4:31-44 is closely followed in Mark 1:21-39. There is just sufficient expansion of language to justify the presumption that the same manuscript was used, or possibly here as well in a few other places, the Gospel of Luke itself. In point of correctness, it has been already noticed that Sandy places this gospel below Luke. The same view is taken by Schleiermacher. Speaking of synoptics, he says that in comparing Luke with Matthew and Mark, he sees evidence that the corresponding narratives in the latter Gospels were originally more hastily taken down or were obscured by passing through many hands. Pursuing the analysis, MS number 10, Luke 5:1-11 is not in Mark, though there is a shorter account of a similar transaction. Number 11, Luke 5:12-16 is contained in Mark 1:40-45, but with such an important change at the close as to draw from Schleiermacher the following remark. By this alteration, the history assumes almost an apocryphal character, and if on this one hand we acknowledge the instruction we receive by this very circumstance of Mark's narrative, it is no less true, on the other hand, that the comparison is the more unfavorable to him, as his additions frequently tend to this sort of exaggeration. Number 12, Luke 5:17-26. All but the first verse is found substantially the same in Mark 2:2-12. Number 13, also, Luke 5:27-39 is closely followed in Mark 2:14-22. So also, number 14, Luke 6:1-11 in Mark 2:23-3:5. Okay. In number 15, Luke 6:12-7, 10. Don't know how to do those yet. We first find a break in a manuscript, hitherto such as were used being inserted entire, though with alterations. Mark contains the first and last portion of this, while the middle part containing portions of the Sermon on the Mount is omitted. The circumstances connected with the choosing of the 12, Schleiermacher thinks, were misunderstood by Mark. He had hitherto, he says, followed Luke. Note that I would assert with Griesbach that he had before him the whole of the present Gospel of Luke, but this collection he most probably had. After showing that the matter was not properly understood by Mark, he says, under these circumstances, I do not at all see why one should take pains trying all possible explanations, some of them in the highest degree improbable, to show how Jude, the son of James, and Lebbaeus, who was named Thaddeus, may be one person. Number 16, Luke 7:11-50, not in Mark. Schleiermacher is perplexed at not finding the miracle of Nain related by any evangelist but Luke, especially considering the scanty number of instances of restoration to life. He thinks the event was recorded by someone who had heard of it at Capernaum or Jerusalem, and who did not wish to trouble the apostles by applying to them for confirmation of the account. Number 17, Luke 8:1-21 is again broken up, being found neither entire nor in the same order in Mark. The most of it finds a parallel with much amplification in Mark 4:1-25 and 3:31-35. Commenting upon the contents of this manuscript, Schleiermacher says this edition belongs undoubtedly to the number of accumulations and exaggerations which are so very common with Mark, both in the introductions to the several incidents in his gospel and in the general statements which he occasionally inserts to fill up a chasm. Number 18, Luke 8:22-56 finds a close parallel in Mark 4:36-5:43. The manuscript was inserted entire, not, however, without the usual amplification in the different narratives. Number 19, Luke 9, 1-45, this manuscript with many variations and the insertion of much new matter may be traced as follows. Mark 6, 7-16, same chapter, verse 30-44, chapter 8, 27-31, same 34-38, chapter 9, verse 1-11, same, 17-29, and verses 31 and 32. Number 20, Luke 9, 46-50, paralleled in Mark 9, 33-40, to which is subjoined much not in Luke, but parallels to which may be found in Matthew. MSS, Nos 21-25 inclusive, comprising Luke 9:51-13:9, not in Mark except a few verses, Mark 3, 22-27, parallel with part of number 25. Nos 26-29 inclusive, Luke 13, 10-17, 19, not in Mark. Number 30, wow. Luke 17, 17:20-19:48. First division, 17:20-18:14, not in Mark. You're so lucky that I put the page up there, because I could imagine this is beyond goofy just listening to it. Not in Mark. The first part of the second division, Luke 18, 15-43, finds parallel in Mark 10, 13-34, and verse 46-52. The balance of the second division, Luke 19, 1-28, has no parallel in Mark, while again the third division, Luke 19, 29-48, will be found, followed more or less closely in Mark 11, 1-18. Number 31, Luke chapters 20 and 21, parallel Mark 11, 27-31, and chapters 12 and 13. Number 32, Luke 22, 1 to 23, 49, parallels Mark 14, 1 and 2, same chapter, verses 10-17, verses 22-24, verse 26, verse 32, verse 35-38, verse 43-49, verse 53, 54, and 61-72. Also, chapter 15, verse 1-15, 21-33, and 37-41. In all this, we discover parallels by no means complete to only a portion of number 32. It is impossible to believe that the authors of Luke and Mark here used a common manuscript. The author of Mark, we may suppose, drew somewhat from the manuscript, something from tradition, and much from his imagination. Number 33, Luke 23, 50 to the end. Whatever parallel to this there may be in Mark is in the last part of the gospel, but Mark here diverges much from the others. The last 12 verses are generally by scholars considered spurious. As a result of the foregoing analysis, it will be seen that of the 33 manuscripts in Luke, the first 8 are wanting in Mark, being the same, except number 8, which were wanting also in Marcion. Of the other 25, 10 are omitted entirely and 8 are inserted entire, while the others are more or less broken and disjointed, some of them so much so as to lose their identity completely. This result, while it confirms the theory of Schleiermacher, recognizing as it does the identity of completeness of most of the manuscripts at the same time, would indicate that the German theologian had in some instances carried his division too far and had specified as distinct manuscripts some portions of Luke which were founded upon tradition and composed by the author himself. The Gospel, according to Mark, is supposed to have been written at Rome. It was not quoted by Tertullian in Africa. At Rome, where the Gospel was probably composed, the stories in Luke concerning the infancy of Jesus, so manifestly of Eastern original, had not yet obtained much credence. They were accordingly omitted. In this respect, the Gospel of Marcion was, in that portion of Christendom considered the most reliable and was looked upon as evidence that the early biography of Jesus was unknown. The Gospel of Peter is supposed to have contained the substance of the oracles of Matthew, and as the former was at the basis of Mark and the latter of Matthew, that would account for much of the similarity between Mark and Matthew without assuming that any portion of either was copied directly from the other. Mark has almost a complete parallel in Luke and Matthew taken together. There are but 24 verses which have no parallel in either of the other synoptics. As to the order in which these Gospels were written, much has been said, but the subject is in the utmost confusion and uncertainty. That St. Mark wrote later than St. Luke, says Macaulay, I have no doubt. Baronius, Bellarmine, and some others think this gospel was first written in Latin. This is not improbable if it was composed at Rome late in the 2nd century. That the gospel in its present form was not the work of Mark, the companion of the apostles, is the opinion of Credner and several other evangelical writers, among whom Mr. Sandy may be included. All right, chapter 30, the Gospel according to John. But little light can be thrown upon the Gospel of John by any comparison with the manuscripts of Luke. The first manuscript to which any similarity can be found is number 19, the account of the feeding of the multitude by a miracle. But the differences in the narratives are very great. According to all the synoptics, Jesus had retired to a desert place. In Luke, it is stated that it belonged to the city of Bethsaida. According to John, he had gone up into a mountain. According to this historian, it was on the eve of a Jewish Passover. This, the synoptics say nothing about, nor do they connect Jesus with any Passover except the one at which he suffered. According to Mark and Matthew, who continue the narrative, Jesus sent away the multitudes and retired into a mountain to pray. According to John, he departed into a mountain, though he was already in a mountain, to avoid the multitude who wished to take him by force and make him a king. It will be remembered that this manuscript could not be fully identified in Mark. These were probably different versions of a common tradition. The essential features of the tradition were that a multitude consisting of 5,000 men, besides the women and children, had been fed by Christ upon 5 loaves and 2 fishes. The next parable is number 30. Of the contents of this long manuscript, there is but the circumstance of Jesus riding on a colt, the foal of an ass, which is briefly noticed as the fulfillment of a prophecy. This manuscript also could not be recognized distinctly in Mark, and there is no reason to believe it was used in John. Number 32, Luke 22, 1-23, and 49. Portions of this MS have partial parallels in John 13, 1-30, verse 36-38, chapter 18, verse 1-18, 24-28, 33-40, chapter 19, verse 15-25, and 28-30. Number 33, Luke 23, 50 to the end. The first part of this manuscript, narrating the begging of the body of Jesus and his burial by Joseph of Arimathea, had a closer parallel in John than any of the previous ones, John 19:38-42. The balance of it, however, after the coming of Mary Magdalene to the sepulchre, cannot be recognized. Thus, it will be seen that not a single manuscript in Luke can be completely traced in John. In some instances, the writer may have used Luke or Mark. The inference is that Luke and John were not composed from common sources. The same result will follow upon comparing John with Mark and Matthew. The Gospel of John stands alone. It has every mark of being an original gospel, while the synoptics are compilations made, for the most part, for the purpose of preserving the early traditions of the disciples concerning the life and teachings, the sufferings, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus. The Gospel of John is a theological document written for theological purposes. The first express testimony to the existence of this gospel is that of Theophilus, Bishop of Antioch, AD 180, who speaks of it thus. And hence the Holy Writings teach us and all the Spirit-bearing, inspired men, one of whom, John says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, etc. Here, John is not spoken of as an apostle, but as a spirit-bearing or inspired man. Such the writer, may have considered John the presbyter of the 2nd century, who is by many thought to be the author of the gospel. The internal character of this gospel is quite inconsistent with the theory of it having been written by the unlettered fisherman, the son of Zebedee. It is hardly possible that such a person could have become the educated and philosophical theologian whose pen is to be traced in the Gospel of John. It is written in purer and less Hebreistic Greek than the other Gospels, and its style is elegant and graceful. John the Apostle, son of Zebedee, was a Jew, but the author of the Gospel of John refers to the Jews in the third person. He speaks of the feasts of the Jews, the Passover of the Jews, the manner of the purifying of the Jews, etc. The law of Moses is spoken of as your law and their law. Furthermore, the Jews are denounced as the children of the devil. The fact that this gospel, the full and absolute divinity of Christ, is first distinctly taught is evidence also that it was not written by a Jew. The divinity of Jesus was not a doctrine of the Jewish Christians. It originated with Gentiles, formerly idolaters. To the Jew, it meant polytheism. The early Jewish Christians held Christ to be a man only. There are also many errors in reference to the geography of the country. The author speaks of Enon, near to Salem in Judea, also of Bethany, beyond Jordan, and of a city of Samaria called Sychar. If there were any such places, they were strangely unknown to the writers. The learned Dr. Bert Schneider points out such mistakes and errors of the geography, chronology, history, and statistics of Judea as no person who had ever resided in that country or had been by birth a Jew could possibly have committed. Even the birthplace of John himself, Bethsaida or Julius, is assigned to Galilee when it was situated in another country. This mistake alone is fatal to the authority of the gospel. This is conceded by Hugh, provided it cannot be explained. An attempt has been made to explain it by showing that it was the custom of the people to speak of the Gaulonite country as Galilee. Josephus is cited as calling Judas the Galilean or Gaulonite. Josephus 4 times refers to Judas as a Galilean. The only place where he is spoken of otherwise is manifestly a mistake on the part of some transcriber and arose from the fact that there were 2 cities by the name of Gamala, one in Gaulonitis, the other in Galilee. No doubt the passage in Josephus, a Gaulonite of a city whose name was Gamala, should read a Galilean of a city whose name was Gamala. It would then correspond with the other passages in Josephus and with the Acts of the Apostles, 5:37, in all of which he was called Judas of Galilee. Galilee was a well-known district of a country, of country, with well-defined boundaries, and it is absurd to suppose that another country entirely disconnected with it was called Galilee without further evidence than this passage of Josephus. The conclusion is that the author of the Gospel of John was ignorant of the birthplace of John the Apostle. This gospel differs from all 3 of the synoptics in relating several events which occurred when John the Apostle was not present, while, strangely enough, other transactions in which, according to the synoptics, the Apostle John was present are not related in the Gospel of John at all, particularly the transfiguration, which, according to all the synoptics, took place in the presence of Peter, James, and John. That John had neglected to testify where his testimony would naturally be expected was noticed very anciently by Faustus the Manichaean in his controversy with Augustine. Speaking of the passage, think not that I am come, etc. Matt 17, he says, who testifies that Jesus said this? Matthew. Where did he say it? On the mountain. Who were present? Peter, Andrew, James, and John. Others, but not Matthew himself. He had not as yet chosen Matthew, but one of these 4, John, wrote a gospel. Well, then, he relates this somewhere. No, not at all. How is it, then, that John, who was on the mountain, does not testify, and that this was written by Matthew, who becomes a follower of Jesus some time after he descended from the mountain? It is therefore very doubtful whether Jesus said this, because a proper witness is silent while an improper witness testifies. The writer of this gospel quotes the Old Testament prophecies almost as loosely and with as little regard to their applicability as the author of Matthew. Psalms 41:9, quoted in John 13:18, did not refer to Christ nor to Judas. So of John 17:12. So strong is the evidence of a late date to this gospel that its apostolic origin is being abandoned by the ablest evangelical writers. Westcott says the earliest account of the origin of the gospel is already legendary. Dr. Davidson, author of the article on the canon in the new edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, says its Johannine authorship must be abandoned, and its existence prior to AD 140 cannot be maintained. Both Irenaeus and Jerome assert that John wrote against Cerinthus. Cerinthus flourished about AD 145. Again, there is evidence that in the construction of this gospel, as in that of Matthew, the author had in view the building up of the Roman hierarchy, the foundations of which were then about AD 177-8 being laid. In the 21st chapter is a detailed account of the appearance of Jesus after his resurrection to 7 of his disciples at the Sea of Tiberias, something not heard of in the Synoptic Gospels, and which bears the impress of an original narrative suggested by scenes in Christ's ministry. After they had dined, Jesus is made to say to Peter, "Feed my sheep," an injunction which was afterward repeated. In Matthew only is Peter made the rock on which the church was to be built, and in John only he enjoined to feed the sheep of Christ. There is reason to believe that both Gospels were written in the interest of the supremacy of the Church of Rome. Okay, chapter 31. The Gospel according to Matthew. The Gospel of Matthew presents at once phenomena of the most varied and inexplicable character, while many of its narratives and of its records of the sayings of Christ from the brevity and simplicity are recognized as among the oldest traditions, and as having been taken from near the fountainhead. The Gospel itself bears, in other places, internal evidence of a comparatively late origin. The persistent statements of Jerome, supported by Epiphanius, that the Gospel of the Hebrews was the Hebrew form of the Gospel of Matthew, statements not at all borne out by the fragments of the Gospel of the Hebrews which they have given, still further complicate a question in other respects sufficiently difficult. Many writers, not willing to discard altogether the assertions of Jerome and Epiphanius, have supposed our Matthew to be a translation from a more correct version of the Hebrew gospel than that quoted by those fathers, and that the differences between those quotations and the Greek Matthew are to be accounted for, partly by the difference in the Hebrew versions and partly by the freedom of translation. Among these, Bishop Marsh is one of the most eminent. Others, giving but little credit to these fathers, whom in other matters they have found so unreliable, and resting the case upon internal evidence, have pronounced the Gospel of Matthew an original Greek production. This view is strongly maintained by Jones and other modern critics. The manuscripts of Luke compared with Matthew. There is a partial parallel in the 3rd chapter of Matthew to the first part of manuscript number 7, Luke 3, 1-22, omitting the genealogies, which are entirely different. The parallel is resumed and more closely followed in the history of the temptation. MS number 8, Luke 4, 16-30, has no parallel in Matthew. Number 9, Luke 4, 31-44, which had a complete parallel in Mark, finds only a partial parallel in Matthew, commencing with verse 38 of Luke, Matt 8:14, and giving an account of the healing of Simon's wife's mother and other sick people. We early find evidence of that tendency to amplification and exaggeration which is characteristic of the author of this gospel, although in accordance with the accounts in the other synoptics, he states in verse 16 that when the even was come, they brought unto him many that were possessed of devils, and he cast out the spirits with the word and healed all that were sick, adding, according to his custom, a reference to the fulfillment of prophecy. And though he had also stated in chapter 4, verse 23, that Jesus went about all Galilee teaching, etc., and healing all manners of sickness and all manner of disease among the people, he there adds, after the narrative has been closed by the other historians, the following. Verse 24. And his fame went throughout all Syria, and they brought unto him all sick people that were taken with divers diseases and torments, and those who were possessed with devils, and those who were lunatic, and those who had the palsy, and he healed them. Manuscript number 10, Luke 5, 1-11, cannot be traced to Matthew, though there is a shorter account of the calling of the 4 disciples corresponding to that in Mark. Number 11, Luke 5, 12-16. The parallel account of Matthew is shorter than in Luke or Mark. This is one of the places which indicate Matthew as containing the earlier narrative. The account of this miracle as related in the Acts of Pilate is shorter than either of these. Number 12, Luke 5, 17-26, parallel Matthew 9, 1-8. Number 13, Luke 5, 27-39, see Matthew 9, 9-17, which has a close resemblance. So also number 14, Luke 6, 1-11, Matthew 12, 1-13. Number 15, Luke 6, 12-7 and 10. The last 10 verses of this manuscript describing the healing of the centurion's servant are paralleled in Matthew 8, 5-13. The other portion, which commences with the choosing of the 12 and consists principally of saying of Jesus, can hardly be considered parallel by the Sermon on the Mount, which is much more extensive. Number 16, Luke 7, 11-50, which has no parallel in Mark, has a partial parallel in Matthew. See Luke 7, 18-35, and Matthew 11, 2-19. Number 17, Luke 8, 1-21, see Matthew 13, 1-25, and 12, 46-50, where the parallel is nearly complete. Number 18, Luke 8, 22-56, parallel Matt 8, 18, verses 23-34, chapter 9, 18-25. 19, Luke 9, 1-45, Matt 10, 1-15, 14, 1-2, verses 13-21, chapter 16, 13-16, 20, verses 21-28, and chapter 17, 1-23. This manuscript, if used at all, is completely broken up. 20, Luke 9, 46-50, Matthew 18, 1-6. 21, Luke 9, 51-10. Wait, yeah, 10-24. All right, got it. Partial parallel in Matt 8, 19-22. Manuscript 22, 23, and 24, Luke 10, 25-11, 13. No parallel in Matthew. Number 25, Luke 11, 14-13, 9. Partial parallel Matthew 12-22-30 and verse 38-45. 26-29, Luke 13, 10-17, 19. No parallel. Number 30, Luke 17, 20-19-48. The first division, 17-20-18-14, has no parallel. The first part of second division, 18-15-30, has a parallel. Matt 19-13-30. Luke 18-31-43 has Matt 20, 17-19, and 20, 29-34. Luke 19, 29-38 has Matthew 21, 1-9, and Luke 19, 45-46 has Matt 21, 12, 13. These partial parallels do not, however, identify the manuscript. Number 31, Luke chapters 20 and 21, partial parallels, Matt 21, 23-27, 33-45, chapters 22, verses 15, 32, verse 41-46, chapter 23, verse 5-7, verse 14, and chapter 24, verse 1-44, following which are lengthy sayings of Christ found in Matthew alone. Number 32, Luke 22, 1-23 and 49, Matt 26, 3-5, 14-25, the parallel considerably broken, Matt 27, 1-11-56. Number 33, Luke 23:50 to the end. Some partial parallels, Matt 27:57 to the end. Recapitulation. 5 of the manuscripts are complete in Matthew, though with the customary changes and accumulation. Some dozen of the others have parallels more or less extensive. There is indicated a common use of manuscripts, though not to so great an extent as by the authors of Luke and Mark. We will now proceed to consider some of the indications of a late date for the construction of the Gospel of Matthew. 1. That Matthew was written for theological purposes and for the use of the church after it had become pretty well established, is shown by the frequent reference to the prophecies and the manifest anxiety to show that the events related were in fulfillment of the predictions referred to. True, the author is quite uniformly unfortunate in his selection of prophecies, scarcely one of which has any reference to the subject matter to which it is applied, but the object of the writer is nevertheless apparent. 2. The comparatively late composition of this work may be inferred from the many additions of incidences of a striking and marvelous character not contained in the other Gospels. Notably among these are the earthquakes at the crucifixion and the resurrection, both of which were known to this historian only. Also the opening of the graves and the rising of the saints. Schittelmacher, in comparing Luke with Mark and Matthew, sees evidence that the corresponding narratives in the latter Gospels were originally more hastily taken down and were obscured by passing through a great number of hands. Speaking of the account of casting out the devils, Matt 8:28-33, he says, the alteration made here by introducing 2 demonics, in itself improbable, as it is not unusual for madmen to contact a close friendship and intimacy with each other, might indeed admit of a different explanation, as other instances of a similar duplication are found in Matthew. In regard to the feeding of the multitudes, notwithstanding the statement in Matthew 16, Schittelmacher thinks there was but one feeding and that Matthew was misled by having 2 different accounts of the same transaction. Speaking of Matt 16:13-28, he says, no one will readily believe that Christ in the same breath, as it were, would deliver to Peter the key of the kingdom of heaven and then call him a Satan, who did not favor the things which be of God. He thinks the manner in which Matthew represents the transfiguration shows that the account had passed through several hands. In this narrative, he says, one perceives the exclusive direction of the reporter's imagination towards the marvelous. On this account, the assertion that the 2 figures were Moses and Elias appear far more confident than in Luke, in whose narrative every attentive reader easily sees that it is founded merely on the expression of Peter in a state between sleeping and waking. In the same way, we may remark likewise in the healing of the epileptic in Matthew a distortion in extravagance. After commenting at length upon the circumstance, he says, Matthew, therefore, either has had a less authentic reporter here, or perhaps only obscured the state of the case by his habit of annexing an analogous matter. In the account in Matthew corresponding to Luke 19:46-50, Schittelmacher thinks much is annexed with was not spoken on the occasion. He comments on the incoherence in the narratives of Matthew. Referring to the duplication of the blind men at Jericho, he says Matthew had before done something of the same sort in the case of the demonic, I think, at Gadara. How the mistake happened, he does not undertake to determine. Speaking of Matt 21:1-17, he says, as to what is said in Matthew, somewhat strangely indeed, of 2 animals, I can only explain it by the attempt to make the application of the fact to the passage in Zechariah as close as possible. Any other explanation appears to be lost labor. For if Matthew is to be reconciled with the rest, it must have been properly the polos which Christ bespoke for himself. But when the polos is able to bear the weight of a man, though it has never been ridden, the she-ass no longer runs by its side, but has long left it to itself. He thinks the rending of the veil poetical, so also the opening of the graves and the rising of the saints from the dead as related by Matthew. 3. One circumstance indicating a late date for this gospel is the passage Matt 23:35. that upon you may come all the righteous blood shed upon the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel unto the blood of Zacharias, son of Barachas, whom ye slew between the temple and the altar. In Luke, this is quoted from the apocryphal book called the Wisdom of God, and is applied to Zacharias, who perished between the altar and the temple. Luke 11:49-51. The passage was not Marcion. In Luke, though the place of the death of Zechariah is not described with entire correctness, the reference is in all probability to Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada. But this was ending a long way back the list of prophets whose blood had been shed unjustly. The author of Matthew, wishing to bring it down to a latter date, adds son of Barachias. This changes the personage at once and brings the scene down to a date subsequent to the time of Christ. Zacharias, son of Baruchos, was massacred by the Zealots inside the temple shortly before the siege of Jerusalem, about AD 69. It is evident that this portion of the Gospel of Matthew was written not only after the destruction of Jerusalem, but a long time after. It will be noticed that these words are not here, as in Luke, quoted from the wisdom of God. They are put into the mouth of Jesus himself, who is made to allude to an event as in the past, which took place more than 30 years after. No one writing immediately after the destruction of Jerusalem could have made such a mistake, but a writer living more than 100 years afterwards might do so. Suppose 1,000 years hence a history should be under examination which should represent Andrew Jackson as speaking of something as then past which had occurred near our own time, say the death of Senator Chandler. Would not that be evidence that the history was written not only after the death of Chandler, but a long time after? 4. In Matthew 27:8, after stating that the chief priests took the silver pieces which Judas had thrown away and brought with them the potter's field to bury strangers in, it is added, wherefore that field was called the field of blood unto this day. The phrase unto this day implies a very long time between the transaction and the time of relating it. So again, Matt 28:15, in relating the bribing of the soldiers by the chief priests, there is the following. So they took the money and did as they were taught, and this saying is commonly reported among the Jews until this day. 5. Evidence of the late construction of Matthew is to be found in an attempt in the 16th chapter to specially connect Peter with the foundation of the Christian church. The narrative of the conversation between Jesus and Peter, as given in Luke and Mark, contains nothing of the kind. That this was a later interpolation in the gospel history made in the interest of the Roman Catholic hierarchy, then being established, will become more manifest by comparing the accounts in the synoptic gospels as follows. How do I want to do this? Shoot. Maybe I'll put both pages up at the same time. I'll read all of, I don't know how to read that. Yeah, I'm thinking. I'm going to read all Luke first, then Mark, then Matthew. Luke chapter 9:18, his disciples were with him, and he asked them, saying, whom say the people that I am? They, answering, said, John the Baptist, but some say Elias, the others say that one of the old prophets is risen again. He said unto them, but whom say ye that I am? Peter answering said, the Christ of God. And he straitly charged them and commanded them to tell no man that thing. Mark chapter 8:27. And by the way he asked his disciples, saying unto them, whom do men say that I am? And they answered, John the Baptist, but some say Elias, and others one of the prophets. 29. And he saith unto them, but whom say ye that I am? And Peter answereth and saith unto him, thou art Christ. And he charged them that they should tell no man of him. Matthew chapter 16:13. He asked his disciples, saying, whom do men say that I, the Son of Man, am? And they said, some say John the Baptist, some Elias, and others Jeremias, or one of the prophets. He saith unto them, But whom say ye that I am? And Simon Peter answered and said, Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus answered and said unto him, Blessed art thou, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood hath not revealed it unto thee, but my Father who is in heaven. And I say also unto thee that thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. And I will give unto thee the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatsoever thou shalt bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatsoever thou shalt loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Then charged his disciples that they should tell no man that he was Jesus the Christ. From the closeness of the parallel, it is obvious that the account was taken from a common manuscript or from a common tradition. The saying of Christ to Peter, Blessed art thou, etc., if it had ever been uttered, was too important to be omitted by the other historians. It is a manifest interpolation made to give gospel sanction to the hierarchy said to have been established by Peter. About this time, AD 180 to 190, a violent dispute had arisen concerning the celebration of Easter. The Church at Rome was endeavoring to control the question and to make it the occasion for the establishment of a supreme power. The Asiatic churches had rebelled against its pretensions. It was very important to conciliate them. Let us suppose that at this juncture this gospel had appeared at Alexandria, whose bishop supported Rome. It would at once be adopted in the churches of Africa, Gaul, and Italy, all of which were favorable to the papal claims. It would then be circulated in Asia Minor among the churches imbued with Jewish traditions, and among whom the name of Peter was all-powerful and would have an immense influence in favor of consolidation. Hold on. The Epistle of Clement of Rome to James was, it is to be presumed, already in circulation, in that it was stated that Peter had at Rome given to Clement in the presence of the congregation the keys of the kingdom, and had used almost the very words here attributed to Jesus. Peter had said of Clement to the church, Wherefore I communicate to him the power of binding and loosing, so that with respect to everything which he shall ordain in the earth, it shall be decreed in the heavens. He shall bind what ought to be bound and loose what ought to be loosed, as knowing the rule of the church. It only needed a gospel showing that Christ had conferred this power upon Peter, and the chain of title of the Roman pontiff was complete. When, where, and by whom written? No writer of the first centuries ever assigned a date to the Gospel of Matthew except Irenaeus, whose testimony is generally discarded. He states that it was written for the Jews while Peter and Paul were founding the church at Rome. If, says Bishop Marsh, the arguments in favor of a late date for the composition of St. Matthew's Gospel being compared with those in favor of an early date, it will be found that the former greatly outweigh the latter. According to the law of accretion, Matthew would stand next to Luke in point of antiquity. On the other hand, it has been seen that several considerations point forcibly to a late date for its composition. It remains to be considered whether there is any theory which will explain these seemingly contradictory phenomena. We venture to make a suggestion which, if not entirely correct, may lead to such inquiries as will result in a correct solution. About AD 180, Pantanius was sent from Alexandria as a missionary to India. It is said that he there found a Gospel of Matthew which had been left in India many years before by Bartholomew, who had preached in that country. There has been much discussion as to what this Gospel of Matthew, sometimes called the Gospel of Bartholomew, was. Let us suppose it was a copy of the Oracles of Matthew to which had been attached some brief narrative of the ministry of Christ. It would be, in that case, one of the oldest copies in existence. Suppose this copy was brought back to Alexandria accompanied with some old manuscripts of genealogies that some zealous Christian in that city, wishing to aid in the consolidation of the church, then going on, undertook from these and other materials to write a new gospel, that it was published in Alexandria. Such a work would fulfill all the conditions and would exhibit the complex character now found in the Gospel of Matthew. The oracles and accompanying narrative would furnish, in some cases, the most authentic records and in the shortest and simplest form of any yet published, and this would of itself justify an addition to the Gospels then in circulation. The author would have before him the Gospels of the infancy and the Gospels of Mark and Luke. That Pantaeus was a Jew we learn from Clement of Alexandria, who speaks of him as a Hebrew of Palestine, whom he found concealed in Egypt, and who was the true Sicilian bee, gathering the spoil of the flowers of the prophetic and apostolic meadow. Chapter 32, Acts of the Apostles. The book entitled The Acts of the Apostles does not much differ in its general character from other writings of the kind which were in circulation among the Christians of the 2nd century. There were Acts of the Apostles supposed to have been written by Lucius. There were the Acts of the Holy Apostles, Peter and Paul, the Acts of Peter and Andrew, the Acts of Philip, the Acts of Paul and Thesla, etc. The same bold appeal to the love of the marvelous, the same disregarded of historical facts and geographical and chronological accuracy, which are to be seen in those writings, characterize also the Acts of the Apostles. Gaza is spoken of as a deserted place, though at the time it was a flourishing city. In Acts 5:34-36, Gamaliel is represented as referring in a speech to Theudas, and to acts of his which were not performed until some 40 years after the time referred to, and more than 10 years after the time when Gamaliel was delivering his address. Again, the reference in the 21st chapter to the Egyptian impostor does not at all agree with the historical account of the same transaction as given by Josephus. There is the same loose reference in the prophecies as in John and Matthew. This work had but an indifferent standing among the fathers. As late as at the commencement of the 5th century, Chrysostom said, "This book is not so much as known to many. They know neither the book nor by whom it was written. The text has always been very uncertain. The Cambridge MS Codex Bezae has 600 interpolations. The author is supposed to have been the same as the compiler of the Gospel of Luke, a theory based upon the preface to each and which finds some confirmation in linguistic peculiarities and similarity of style. That it was written late in the 2nd century may be safely assumed. The following passage is from the writings of Aristides, the sophist, who flourished about AD 176. The similarity in style and incidents to the 27th chapter of Acts will be at once apparent. We were going to Cephallenia, and again we had a high sea and a contrary wind, and we were tossed up and down to the great detriment of my health and beyond what my constitution could bear. Afterward, the like happened in the straits of Achaia, when truly the good mariners would put out from Patrae at the very time of the equinox against my will and very much to my prejudice under my indispositions. The like things happened again in the Aegean Sea through the obstinacy of the master of the ship and of the mariners when they would sail through the wind, though the winds were contrary, nor would they hearken to me. So we were carried about to the tempest over the whole sea for 14 days and nights, and were oftentimes without food, and at length with difficulty got to Miletus. There is no reason to believe that Aristides had ever seen the Acts or any other book of the New Testament. That the Acts of the Apostles also was written in the interest of the Roman Catholic hierarchy must be obvious to anyone who will give the matter careful consideration. In the Acts, a prominence is given to Peter, not to be found elsewhere in the New Testament if we accept the two passages already spoken of. It was Peter who made a speech showing the necessity of selecting another apostle in the place of Judas. The Catholic historians add that he presided over the election of Matthias. It was Peter who made the great speech on the day of the Pentecost and who first preached to the Jews. It was he who first announced that the gospel was to go to the Gentiles. It was Peter whom Paul came to Jerusalem to see, and as Bassett says, to study. It was Peter who was a prominent actor at, and as the Catholic historians have it, presided over the Council of Jerusalem. Peter is everywhere prominent, everywhere making speeches and directing the affairs of the church. He is the pillar apostle of both Jews and Gentiles. Several of these accounts giving such prominence to Peter are in direct conflict with the writings of Paul. It was the policy of the author of the Acts, writing in the interest of the Catholic Church and aiming at unity of doctrine, to ignore the well-known differences that existed all through the early age of the Church between Peter and James and their Judaistic followers on the one hand, and Paul and the Gentile Christians on the other. Accordingly, in the Acts, Paul is represented as preaching to the Jews at Samaria and Jerusalem immediately after his conversion, although he himself distinctly informs us in the epistle to the Galatians that he preached to the Gentiles 17 years before preaching to the Jews at all. 3 years after his conversion, he went up to Jerusalem but saw only Peter and James. 14 years afterwards, he went up by revelation and communicated to the Jews, even then privately at first, the gospel which he had been preaching among the Gentiles. In the Acts, not only does Paul preach at once to the Jews, but Peter becomes the apostle to the Gentiles. He is made to say, "Ye know how that a good while ago God made choice among us, that the Gentiles by my mouth should hear the word of the gospel and believe." Thus the distinction so much dwelt upon by Paul between himself and the apostle of the Gentiles of the uncircumcision, and Peter as the apostle of the Jews, the circumcision, is entirely broken down. Peter preaches to Gentiles and Jews, and Paul to the Jews and Gentiles. This is contrary to what is known of the history of the Christian church in the first century, and inconsistent with the declaration of Paul. The gospel of the uncircumcision was committed to me as the gospel of the circumcision was to Peter. For he that wrought effectually in Peter to the apostleship of the circumcision, the same was mighty in me towards the Gentiles. Even after the conference at Jerusalem, Paul was obliged to withstand Peter face to face at Antioch. Galatians 2:11. It is plain that the Acts of the Apostles was written in the highest interest of the Roman Catholic Church and in support of the tradition that the Church of Rome was founded by the joint labors of Peter and Paul. This tradition has no foundation except in the writings of one or two fathers of the latter part of the 2nd century, fathers who had in view the same general objective as the author of the Acts of the Apostles. That's it. History of Christian doctrines. A complete history of Christian doctrines would require volumes. It is obvious that within the limits of a single chapter, but a meager outline can be given. The completeness of our work requires at least a brief sketch of the doctrines prevailing in the first 2 centuries. The Immaculate Conception. The first allusion to the Immaculate Conception of Jesus in the epistles of Ignatius, AD 115. The belief in the miracles of Jesus, a belief which became common early in the 2nd century, was naturally connected with his deification and his assignment to a supernatural origin. A being who can disregard and overthrow the laws of nature must needs be a God, and a God must be gotten by a God. Thus, the 3 doctrines may be said to postulate and prove each other. The doctrine of the Immaculate Conception of Jesus, when once announced, rapidly grew into favor and was firmly established as a doctrine of the Church before the close of the 2nd century. The miracles of Jesus. First mention of these was in the Epistle of Barnabas, AD 130, and in the Acts of Pilate and other apocryphal Gospels, which are supposed to have been written about the same time. 100 years of silence by Christian writers is at least wonderful if such miracles were then believed. And equally wonderful is the fact that no Jewish or heathen historian during that period has recorded that such events were reported of Jesus and believed by his followers. It is not probable that Christ ever claimed or pretended to work miracles. Such pretensions would have detracted from his exalted character and would have placed him upon a level with Simon Magus, Apollonius, and other miracle workers of that age. Miracles in the church. Beyond what is contained in the epistles of Paul, it does not appear that any claim was made to the power of working miracles in the church until about the middle of the 2nd century. The material resurrection. The doctrine of the resurrection of the material body of Christ must be placed in the same category. Nothing is heard of it earlier than in the Gospel of the Hebrews, which is generally thought to have been written early in the 2nd century. In the writings of the Fathers, the doctrine first appeared in the middle of the 2nd century. According to the opinion of many, in the 1st century, the soul of the Spirit of Jesus had gone below to a place understood as Hades, under or beneath the earth, and the resurrection was the calling back of the soul to earth and its ascension to heaven. To this doctrine Paul may have alluded when he asked, "Who shall descend into the deep?" That is, to bring up Christ again from the dead. Romans 10:7. The prevailing view of the resurrection, however, as taught by the earlier fathers, is well explained by Neander, the celebrated church historian. He quotes from Origen, who distinguished from the mutable phenomenal form the proper essence lying at the foundation of the body, which remains the same through all the changes of early life, and which, moreover, is not destroyed at death. This proper essence lying at the foundation of the body would, by the operation of the divine power, be awakened to a nobler form, corresponding to the ennobler character of the soul, so that as the soul had communicated its own peculiar stamp to the body, it would then communicate the same to the transfigured body. Spiritualism of the 1st century was destined to be obscured after the death of its most illustrious advocates, Paul and Clement. The Christians of the 2nd century required a grosser form of doctrine. Justin Martyr argued for a resurrection of the flesh. So Athenagoras, in his treatise on the resurrection, maintained that every particle of matter which constitutes the human body would be brought back to its proper place and thought it a reflection of the power of God. To object that the same particles of matter enter into the composition of different bodies. Tertullian thought the dead would be raised with a material body, and afterward the bodies would be changed. A real fleshly body was to be reproduced, and when Christ should appear, it was to be caught up into the air, and then the material body would be changed into a spiritual body. Irenaeus maintains the identity of the future with the present body. In the midst of all this materialism, however, Clement of Alexandria and Origen maintained the spiritualistic views of Paul and Clement of Rome. In the construction of the canonical Gospels, the materialist side prevailed. We there find the resurrection of a material body, which required the stone to be rolled away from before the sepulchre. Divinity of Christ. Paul, though drawing a second broad distinction between God and Jesus Christ through all his epistles, repeatedly designating the latter as a man of the seed of David. At the same time, in other passages, used language capable of another construction and from which was drawn a doctrine, which by successive steps ended in the complete deification of Christ as an essential part of a triune God. The Jewish Christians and many of the Gentiles steadily maintained that Jesus was a man only born in the ordinary course of generation, to which the Gnostics added that Christ as an aeon or divine spirit entered into him at the time of his baptism, from which time he was divinely inspired. Among the mass of Gentile Christians, however, the tendency to deify their great teacher and exemplar was early manifested and rapidly gained in strength and power. The tendency can be traced among all the Orthodox fathers. Ignatius speaks of him as Jesus Christ our God, and similar expressions are to be found in other early Christian writers. The testimony of Pliny is that the Christians were accustomed to meet before daybreak and sing a responsive hymn, Carmen Decere Secum Invicem, to Christ as to God, Christo quasi Dio. Whether in so doing they were not giving countenance to polytheism, the Christians of that day did not stop to inquire. They were too enthusiastic in the new religion to formulate scientific creeds or to make time to establish consistency of doctrine. Justin Martyr was the first who undertook to give a definite shape to the doctrine. He maintained that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who appeared to Moses in the flaming bush, was the Word, or Christ, who, he says, was also called angel and apostle. While he was God, he was entirely distinct from God the Father in every respect, except that he was begotten or produced from him by emanation, as a ray of light proceeds from the sun. He is very emphatic in maintaining that Christ is really different from the Father. This rational power, he says, is not like the light of the sun, merely nominally different from the Father, but really another numerically. This he illustrates by fire kindled from a fire, which says he see to be distinct from it. He repeatedly speaks of Christ as God, but so far from asserting his identity with the Father, either in person or essence, he says, they who affirm that the Son is the Father are proved neither to have become acquainted with the Father nor to know that the Father of the universe has a Son. In the same passage, he asserts the divinity of Christ and says he was the first begotten Word of God. Not only does Justin deny the identity of the Son with the Father, but he is equally explicit in excluding the idea of equality between them. Speaking of the Son, he says, we esteem him in the second place, for they proclaim, he says, or says he, our madness to consist in this, that we give to a crucified man a place second to the unchangeable and eternal God, the creator of all. First Apology, chapter 13. The tendency to polytheism, which naturally resulted from an attempt to deify Christ, has thus culminated in Justin Martyr. Here were two gods, the one entirely distinct from and subordinate to the other. A reaction followed, which resulted in the doctrine of the Trinity. The divinity of Christ could not be abandoned. It had taken too firm a hold upon the hearts of the multitude of his disciples. It must now be reconciled with monotheism. This required that the Son should in some way be identified with the Father. The object was accomplished through the growth and development of the doctrine of the Logos. In the writings of Philo in the 1st century, the doctrine of the Word as the only begotten Son of the Father, existing with him as the creative power, was fully taught and elaborated. But Philo, a Jew, knew nothing of Jesus Christ as the Word. Justin Martyr applied this doctrine to Christ, who then became to the Christian the Logos so much dwelt upon by Philo. But Justin did not, as we have seen, identify the Son or the Word with the Father. It was for the author of the Gospel of John, a quarter of the century later, boldly to announce without qualification that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. This was the culmination of the doctrine of the Logos and at the same time the foundation of the Trinity. The disposition to deify Christ had been gaining ground for nearly a century and had finally prevailed without overthrowing monotheism, which was an essential part of the Christian system. No wonder that a gospel which thus so distinctly struck for the first time the key note of that grand anthem which was already in the hearts of multitudes multitudes waiting only for expression, should at once become popular, should be received as canonical, should take its place among the Gospels which had already been selected, that it should be ascribed to an apostle and should maintain its ground without any examinations as to its authenticity as an apostolic production. The Trinity. A solid foundation for the doctrine of the Trinity having thus been laid, the completion of the structure was the work of the next century and a half. The doctrine was scientifically formulated at the Council of Nice, AD 325. From what has been said, it will be seen that it was not a belief of the first 2 centuries. Those who would trace the doctrine to that age refer to the formula of baptism in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Those who used this formula, however, did so without any adequate conception of the doctrine of the Trinity, so far as we have any evidence from the writings of the ante-Nicene fathers. Dr. Shedd, speaking of the formulas employed in the so-called Apostles' Creed, says, "It is as definite a statement of the doctrine of the Trinity as was made in any public document previous to those Sabellian and Arian controversies which resulted in the more exhaustive and technical definitions of the Nicene symbols. Again, those of the primitive fathers who speculated at all upon the Trinity confined their reflections mostly to the relations of the first and second persons. Origen speaks of the Trinity in De Principis, Book 4, 130, according to the Latin of Rufinus, which is not very reliable. All right, then. Nature of the soul. Tertullian held that both body and soul are propagated. The soul of man, he says, like the root of a tree, is drawn out, deducta, into a physical progeny, from Adam, the parent stock. And again, both substances, body and soul, are conceived, finished, and perfected together." In the 3rd century, Origen advocated pre-existence, immortality of the soul. The doctrine of the immortality of the soul does not appear to have been generally held at that time. The soul is not in itself immortal, O Greek, says Tatian, but mortal. If indeed it knows not the truth, it dies and is dissolved with the body, but rises again at last at the end of the world with the body, receiving death by punishment in immortality. Similar views were held by Theophilus of Antioch, who says, "Neither immortal nor yet mortal did he make him, but capable of both." The nature of the soul, as explained by Tertullian, has been seen to be entirely inconsistent with its immortality. How long have I been going? I'll go some more. Free will and predestination. Justin Martyr argued in favor of the freedom of the will and against predestination. The Alexandrian fathers, while they conceded the apostasy, held that the human will has a plenary power of good action and is able to turn by its own inherent power. Clement of Alexandria asserts that to believe or disbelieve is as much at the command of the will as to philosophize or not to philosophize or philosophize. That the first act in regeneration proceeds from man. Let me see how many I got left. Nikes. I'm going to stop there today. 1, 2, 3. The atonement. Dr. Priestley, in his work on the corruptions of Christianity, claims that the atonement is not taught in the New Testament. The statement, as applied to the doctrine in its theological sense, may be technically correct, but we do not see how it can be denied that Paul preached in general terms a doctrine of atonement. The earlier fathers generally followed the language of Paul without attempting any definite statement of the doctrine. They do not appear to connect it with original sin or total depravity. For our sins, says Polycarp, he has even taken death upon himself. Basilides maintains that penal suffering or suffering for the purpose of justice of necessity implies personal criminality in the sufferer, and therefore cannot be endured by an innocent person like Christ. According to Marcion, the suffering was not real, it was only apparent. Clement of Rome speaks of the blood of Christ shed for our salvation and of being justified by faith. There was, says Dr. Shedd, no scientific instruction of the doctrine of the atonement in the writings of the apostolic fathers. 5th period, AD 170 to AD 185. Clement of Alexandria and Origen held qualified views in regard to the atonement. It was a favorite view with Ignatius that the death of Christ brings the human soul into communion with him. Original sin. Wiggers says, all, or at least the greater part of the fathers of the Greek church before Augustine denied any real original sin. This doctrine had a gradual growth and was fully developed by Augustine AD 420. The maximum Tertullian was tradu anime, tradu peccati. The propagation of the soul is the propagation of sin. Dr. Shedd, or Shid, says No controversy arose respecting original sin and regenerating grace until the 5th century. Inherited guilt was first distinctly announced by Augustine. Eternal punishment was taught by Justin Martyr and some others of the 2nd century. We believe, says Justin, that those who live wickedly and do not repent are punished in everlasting fire. The eternal duration of future punishment was denied by Origen and Clement of Alexandria. The good God, says Clement, corrects for these 3 causes. First, that he who is corrected may become better than his former self. Then, that those who are capable of being saved by examples may be driven back, being admonished. And thirdly, that he who is injured may not readily be despised and be apt to receive injury. Origen believed in the final restoration of the whole human race. The intermediate state. Justin Martyr represents the souls of the righteous as taking up a temporary abode in a happy, and those of the wicked in a wretched place, and stigmatizes as heretical the doctrine that souls are immediately received into heaven at death. Tertullian held that martyrs went at once to the abode of the blessed, but that this was a privilege peculiar to them and not granted to other Christians. Providence. Neander considers that the doctrine of providence, and now held throughout Christendom, is peculiarly new. We look in vain for any distinct statement of the doctrine in the words of the ante-Nicene fathers. Creation out of nothing. This was held by some of the fathers. It is distinctly announced in the Shepherd of Hermas, the author of which speaks of God, who brought all things into being out of nothing. Inspiration. There was at this time, says Neander, no coherent and systematic doctrine of inspiration. The Old Testament was held to be inspired, and inspired men were spoken of under the new dispensation. Hagenbach says that Irenaeus first taught the doctrine of inspiration as connected with New Testament books, and cites Irenaeus against heresies 3:16-2. Millenarianism. Barnabas, Hermas, and Papias were millenarians. So also were Justin Martin, Irenaeus, and Tertullian. Justin not only held to the doctrine, but he declared it the belief of all but the Gnostics. The Sabbath. The Jewish Christians insisted upon maintaining the Jewish institutions, particularly circumcision and the Sabbath. Paul protested against it and urged that the Christians were freed from those observances. He cautioned them against permitting any man to judge them in respect of the Sabbath. There is no scriptural evidence of the transfer of the Jewish Sabbath to the first day of the week. On that day, Christians met to commemorate the resurrection of Christ. Baptism. Peculiar emphasis was attached to this rite by the early Christians, that the form of baptism was by immersion, or at least by a washing of the whole body, must be the conclusion from an impartial examination of the writings of the ante-Nicene fathers. The constitution of the Church of Alexandria, which is thought to have been established about the year 200, required the applicant for baptism to be divested of clothing, and after the ordinances had been administered, to be anointed with oil. Justin Martyr speaks of the laver and of baptism as a washing. When the mother of Clement was converted, she was baptized in the sea. Nothing is heard of infant baptism before Irenaeus. He is supposed to refer to it in the chapter on the ministry of Christ, which is quoted at length in another part of this volume. Transubstantiation. This doctrine is expressly sanctioned by Justin Martyr, who says, "So likewise have we been taught the food which is blessed by the prayer of his word, and from which our flesh and blood by transmutation are nourished, is the flesh and blood of that Jesus who was made flesh." The doctrine is apparently sanctioned also in the epistle to the Samaritans, incorrectly attributed to Ignatius, and in other early writings of the church. Religious intolerance. Tertullian did not admit the right of the heretics to use the scriptures. We oppose to them, he says, this step above all others of not admitting them to any discussion of the Scriptures. If in these lie their resources, it ought to be clearly seen to whom belongs possession of the Scriptures, that none may be admitted to the use thereof who has no title at all to the privilege. Secret doctrines and ceremonies. There were exoteric and esoteric doctrines. The esoteric were taught only to members of the church. The instruction in these may have been what is meant by the initiatory proceedings occasionally spoken of in the writings of the early Christians. In the 38th chapter of the 7th book of the Recognitions, a work written in the 2nd or 3rd century, it is stated of the mother of Clement who had been converted. She was then baptized in the sea, and returning to the lodging was initiated in all the mysteries of religion in their order. The secret character of some of the proceedings among the early Christians is alluded to by Dr. Dolinger in the following terms. The veil of mystery in which the Christians shrouded their assemblies for divine service from the beginning fostered the suspicion of indulging in a criminal secret worship. The mysteries of the church must be distinguished from the mere secrecy of their meetings, which was a necessity in times of persecution. The esoteric and exoteric doctrines are alluded to by Origen, who says, "To the carnal they taught the gospel in a literal way, preaching Jesus Christ and him crucified. But two persons farther advanced and burning with love for divine celestial wisdom, they communicated the Logos. Whether there were other secrecies than those of doctrine is uncertain." Doctrine of the Messiah. That Christ was the Messiah whose advent had been predicted by the prophets was believed by all the fathers and is a doctrine too well understood to require further comment. Ew. Antiquity of Christian doctrines. Many of the more prominent doctrines of the Christian religion prevailed among nations of antiquity, hundreds and, in some instances, thousands of years before Christ. The doctrine of the miraculous conception was common in ancient times. The story of Krishna has already been given. Zoroaster also was believed to have been immaculately conceived by a ray from the divine reason. Mars was conceived by Juno touching a flower, and she conceived Vulcan by being overshadowed by the wind. An ancient work entitled Codex Vaticanus gives an account of the Immaculate Conception of Quetzalcoatl, the Mexican savior. One of the sects in China worshipped a savior named Exaka, who was conceived by his mother in her sleep, seeing a white elephant. Yea, the first Chinese monarch was conceived by his mother being struck with a star while traveling. Another legend is that Yu, probably the same as Yah, was conceived from a water lily. Many cases might be mentioned of mortals who had an immaculate conception. Plato, Pythagoras, Tamerlane, Genghis Khan, Apollonius of Tyana, and Augustus Caesar were all supposed to have been the product of immaculate conceptions. Stars also presaged the birth of several of them. Presaged. At the birth of Confucius, 5 wise men from a distance came to the house, celestial music filled the air, and angels attended the scene. The title of Son of God was very common among the ancients, and at the commencement of the Christian era, St. Basil says every uncommonly good man was called the Son of God. When Apollonius, standing before Domitian, was asked why men called him a god, his reply was, "Every good man is entitled to that appellation." An answer which Dr. Albert Reville, a theologian of Rotterdam, thought might throw a bright light upon the divinity of Christ. Miracles. The belief in miracles has been common in all ages of the world. From that time of Uranus, father of the gods, down through all the ages, the world has been filled with wonders. Asclepius raised Hippolytus from the dead. Hercules rescued Cistis from the very hand of death. Actaeon was changed to a stag. The walls of Thebes builded themselves to the music of the flute, while those of Jericho fell before the blast of the priests of Israel. The daughters of Ananias, the high priest, changed everything they chose. No, let me say it again. The daughters of Ananias, the high priest, changed everything they chose into corn, oil, and wine, and their hair of Bernice was changed to a constellation of stars. Meanwhile, Prometheus lay bound on Mount Caucasus, the vultures devouring his vitals, which grew as fast as eaten. The heavens were full of gods, and earth, air, and sea swarmed with myriads of angels, spirits, and demons. Resurrection. Many cases of resurrection from the dead are handed down in the ancient mythologies. Mithras, the mediator of Persia, is said to have risen after 3 days. Also, Quetzalcoatl of Mexico, Osiris of Egypt, and others. Some of these, after their resurrection, ascended into heaven. Krishna, after rising from the dead and appearing to his disciples, ascended to Brahma in heaven. The atonement. This doctrine has in some form pervaded the religion of all countries. Offerings of propitiation to appease the wrath of an offended God or to satisfy the demands of justice have been common in every period of the world. Sometimes they have consisted of fruits of the earth, at other times of animals and men. As nations have advanced in civilization, the offerings have become less bloody in their character. In the Sandwich Islands, anciently human beings were thrown as a sacrifice into the crater of Kilauea, the great volcano. Afterward, animals were substituted and finally products of the earth. The proprietary system of the Jews is still well known. This is considered by Paul as a type of the higher Christian system. The Trinity was an essential feature in the religion of many Oriental nations. The Holy Ghost was the third member under various appellations. In the Hindu Trinity, it was Siva, the other members of the Trinity being Brahma and Vishnu. Mr. Maurice says this notion of a third person in the deity was diffused among all the nations of the earth. Mr. Worsley considers the doctrine one of very great antiquity and generally received by the Gothic and Celtic nations. In the Hindu system, this third person was the holy breath by which living creatures were made. The Holy Ghost became visible in the form of a dove, a tongue of fire, etc. The Holy Ghost was sometimes the agent in Immaculate Conception. In the Mexican Trinity, Huizona was the Father, Bascal the Word, and Ekva the Holy Ghost, by the last of whom Chimalmen conceived and brought forth Quetzalcoatl. When Sesostris invoked the oracle to know who before him could subjugate all things, the answer was, first God, then the Word, and with them the Spirit. Plutarch, in his Life of Numa, shows that the incarnation of the Holy Spirit was known to the ancient Egyptians. The doctrine of the Word as the creative power is also very ancient. The Chinese Bible states that God pronounced this primeval Word and his own eternal and glorious abode sprang into existence. According to the Xenavesta, it was by the Word, more ancient than the Word, that Ormuzd created the universe. The ancient Greek writer Amelius, speaking of the god Mercury, says, and this plainly was the Logos by whom all things were made. Plato taught a trinity of the soul in which it is easy to see analogies pointing to a higher form of the doctrine. It is said there was an ancient Greek inscription on the great obelisk at Rome, thus 1, the mighty God, 2, the begotten of God, and 3, Apollo the Spirit. Confession and remission of sins. These doctrines prevailed anciently in India, also among the ancient Persians and Parsis. In China, the invocation of Amito was held to remit the punishment of the greatest crimes. The doctrines of original sin, fall of man, and endless punishment are all found in the religious systems of several ancient nations. Sprinkling with water was a religious ceremony of much antiquity. This may, in some degree, account for the change of the form of Christian baptism from the immersion to sprinkling. The practice prevailed among the ancient Romans. The sacrament or Eucharist has also an ancient original. It was practiced by the Brahmins of India and was introduced into the mysteries of Mithras. It prevailed also among the ancient Mexicans. The Golden Rule was taught hundreds of years before Christ by Confucius, Aristotle, and many others. Marcus, Aristo of Pella, Dionysius of Corinth, Miltiades, Maximus, Pinitus, Modestus, Mucinus, Church of Vienna and Lyons, Florinus, Blastus, Melito of Sardis, Athenagoras, Claudius Apollinaris, Theophilus of Antioch, Bardesanes, Hermogenes, Bacchus of Corinth, Pantanus, Marseilla, and Hegesippus. Marcus, about AD 170. Marcus was a native of Palestine and a disciple of Valentinius. Valentinianism, says Baron Gould, assumed two forms, broke into two sects, the Marcosians and the Ophites. Marcus was considered heretic. The most that has been preserved concerning him comes through Irenaeus, who treats of him and his followers in the works of heresies as follows. But there is another among these heretics, Marcus by name, who boasts of himself as having improved upon his master. He is a perfect adept in magical impostures, and by this means, drawing away a great number of men, and not a few women, he has induced them to join themselves to him, as to one who is possessed of the greatest knowledge and perfection, and who has received the highest power from the invisible and ineffable regions above. Thus, it appears as if he were really the precursor of Antichrist. After describing some of the magical proceedings of Marcus, he continues, again, handing mixed cups to the women, he bids them consecrate these in his presence, stating that after the consecration of the cups, Marcus would fill larger cups from the smaller ones. Irenaeus proceeds as follows. It appears probable enough that this man possesses a demon as his familiar spirit, by means of which he seems able to prophesy, and also enables as many as he counts worthy to be partakers of his charis themselves to prophecy. He devotes himself especially to women and those such as are well-bred and elegantly attired and of great wealth, whom he frequently seeks to draw after him by addressing them in such seductive words as these. Here giving what purports to be an address of Marcus to the women, exhorting them to receive charis, or the spirit of prophecy. The effect of his speech, he says, is that the women, vainly puffed up and elated by these words, and greatly excited in soul by the expectation that it is herself who is to prophecy, her heart beating violently from emotion, reaches the requisite pitch of audacity, and idly as well as impudently utters some nonsense as it happens to occur to her, such as might be expected from one heated by an empty spirit. Our author does not hesitate to add that the women, deeming herself a prophetess out of gratitude to Marcus, rewards him not only by large possessions, but by yielding up to him her person. Aristo of Pella, AD 175. The dialogue between Jason and Papiscus has been attributed to Aristo. Westcott thinks it uncertain whether he was the author. The same writer adds that the words of the dialogue do not prove anything as to the existence of a New Testament canon. Of the apology which Aristo is said to have delivered to Hadrian, nothing is known. In the 22nd volume of the Ante-Nicene collection are 5 small fragments attributed to Aristo. 4 of these are from the dispute between Jason and Papiscus, cited by Jerome and others. The other is from Eusebius. Dionysius of Corinth, AD 175. Some fragments from this writer are supposed to have been preserved by Eusebius, who in his ecclesiastical history gives what purport to be extracts from his writings. There has been some controversy over certain passages which Canon Westcott supposes to refer to the New Testament, his conclusions being strongly attacked by the author of Supernatural Religion. It is not necessary to notice the discussion further, since any fragments which appear only in Eusebius are absolutely unreliable. This is the writer whom Eusebius cites in reference to the teaching and martyrdom of Paul and Peter. After giving an alleged quotation from Caius, a writer whose works are lost, Eusebius says he superadds the testimony of Dionysius in order that the truth of his history may be still more confirmed. Miltiades, Maximus, Pinitus, about AD 175. But little is known of these writers. Maximus was bishop of Jerusalem. He is probably the one referred to by Eusebius who says he wrote on the origin of evil and on the creation of matter. The same writer refers thus to Pinitus. Referring to the writings of Dionysius of Corinth, he speaks of an epistle to the Gnostians in which Dionysius admonishes Pinitus not to impose upon the brethren without necessity a burden in regard to purity too great to be borne, but to pay regard to the infirmity of the great mass. Pinitus, in reply, admires and applauds Dionysius, but exhorts him at the same time to impart some time or other stronger food and to feed the people under him with writings abounding in more perfect doctrine. When he wrote again, etc. Ecclesiastical History 423. Modestus, Mucinus, A.D. 176. These writers are mentioned by Dr. Lardner as writers of the 2nd century whose works are lost. Churches of Vienna and Lyons, A.D. 177. An epistle is said to have been written by these to certain Eastern churches, and the extracts from it occupy a prominent place in ecclesiastical history. The information comes through Eusebius. The epistle is supposed to contain references to the Protovangelian Gospel. Florinus, Blastus, A.D. 177. Florinus was a presbyter of the Roman Church, was ejected for heresy. He maintained that God was the author of evil. Blastus was of the same school. Melito of Sardis, A.D. 177. It is supposed that some fragments of the lost writings of Melito have been preserved in the ecclesiastical history of Eusebius. In these, some have found, as they have supposed, allusions to the New Testament writings. The inference is by others denied. Macallus was inclined to the opinion also that Melito had testified to the existence of a Syriac version, but Bishop Marsh shows that the inference of Macallus was illogical and unauthorized. The fact is, we have not sufficient evidence as to what Melito wrote. Some Syriac writings have appeared under the name of Melito, but they are not considered genuine. His discourse or apology and some other supposed fragments are given in the 22nd volume of the Ante-Nicene. Athenagoras, A.D. 177. But little is known of Athenagoras beyond the fact that he was an Athenian philosopher, became a Christian, and about the date above mentioned is reputed to have presented to the emperors Marcus Aurelius and Commodus an apology for Christians, which is still extant. A treatise on the resurrection is also attributed to him. In his apology, Athenagoras has been supposed to refer to some of the canonical Gospels, but nothing definite can be determined in regard to it. We may safely accept the conclusion of Dr. Donaldson expressed as follows. Athenagoras makes no allusion to the inspiration of the New Testament writers. He does not mention one of them by name, and one cannot be sure that he quotes from any except Paul. All the passages taken from the Gospels are part of our Lord's discourses and may have come down to Athenagoras by tradition. The passages referred to differ also from those in the canonical Gospels and may have exactly corresponded with older Gospels than extant. The fact that Athenagoras nowhere mentions either of the 4 Gospels by name but becomes the more remarkable when it is considered that he cites by name Moses, Jeremiah, Jonah, Thales, Plato, Homer, Hesiod, Orpheus, Herodotus, Pythagoras, Euripides, Aristotle, and others. Though the Gospels of Luke and Mark and possibly John may then have been written, it is not probable that they were much known or that any names of reputed authors were attached to them. Claudius Apollinaris, A.D. 178, was bishop of Hierapolis. He is said to have participated in the great Paschal controversy. In an extract purporting to be from a work written by him on the Passover, there is a reference to what Matthew had said, and by implication to the Gospel of Matthew. The extract is found in the preface to the Paschal Chronicle, a work of the 7th century. Its genuineness, its geniusness is, however, generally discredited. 3 fragments are given in Ante-Nicene, Volume 22. Theophilus of Antioch, A.D. 180. This writer occupies a prominent place in all the works on the canon. He was Bishop of Antioch. Of his writings, 3 letters to Autoclaus are preserved, in one of which the Gospel of John is expressly mentioned by name, though it is not stated it was written by an apostle. Theophilus is reputed to have written a commentary on the Gospels, which is lost. Bardasanes, Hermogenes, Baculus of Corinth, Pantanaeus, AD 180. The works of these writers are lost except a few fragments. The discourse on fate of Bardasanes is given in Ante-Nicene, volume 22, part 2, page 85. Bardasanes was a native of Mesopotamia and lived at Edessa. He was a man of learning. Some have attributed to Bardasanes the authorship of the Recognitions. Eusebius mentions him in his Ecclesiastical History 20:30. Hermogenes ascribed matter to an irregular motion. Baculus of Corinth was zealous in defending the faith against heretics. He was one of the bishops who convened local councils at the request of Victor of Rome to settle the Paschal controversy. Pantanaeus has been spoken of in connection with the Gospel of Matthew. Alexandria was the scene of his labors. He preceded Clement of Alexandria in the presidency of the Catechetic School or seminary in that city. Soon after, he went as missionary to India. He is said to have been the author of commentaries on the scriptures. Marcia, AD 183. Marcia was a concubine of the Emperor Commodus. Dion Cassius says of her, she is related to have had a great affection for the Christians and to have done them many good offices, she having a great ascendancy over Commodus. Hegesippus, AD 185. Hegesippus was a Jewish Christian of Jerusalem. He traveled extensively in order to become acquainted with the condition of the church and came to Rome during the bishopric of Anicetus, sometime between the years 160 and 170. After about 185, he wrote, it is stated, a historical work called Memoirs in 5 books. It is said to have been a complete history of Christianity down to his own time. It is now lost except a few short fragments, most of them being only such as Eusebius has thought proper to preserve. Hegesippus was an Ebonite and, like the other of that sect, was violently opposed to Paul. The virulence of these Christians against the great apostle of the Gentiles is well illustrated by a fragment of Hegesippus preserved by Gobarus on the 6th century, referring to the words of Paul in 1 Corinthians 2:9. I have not seen nor ear heard, neither have entered into the heart of man the things which God hath prepared for them that loves him. Hegesippus says, these words are vainly spoken, and those who say these things give the lie to the divine writings and to the Lord, saying, blessed are your eyes that see and your ears that hear. This passage is cited by Hegesippus is supposed to be taken from the Gospel of the Hebrews, which Eusebius says Hegesippus used. It will be noticed that the passage agrees in sense while differing in phraseology from Matthew. Hegesippus, though he traveled extensively over the Christian world, makes no mention of the canonical Gospels. Some suppose quotations from them have given rise to the usual discussion. All right. 1, 2, 3. Chapter 35, Review of the Fifth Period. Introduction of the 4 Gospels and Acts of the Apostles, preparatory to the establishment of the papacy. The subject involved in mystery, sources of information gone, slaughter of the innocents. Though we find no mention of the 4 Gospels during the 5th period, with the single exception of the Gospel of John, there is reason to believe they were all written during this time as a part of the structure upon which Roman Catholic dominion was to rest. This relation to Roman Catholicism is more particularly to be noticed in the Gospels of John and Matthew and the Acts of the Apostles. The Gospels of Luke and Mark may have been composed without any special reference to the hierarchy, the one to counteract the influence of Marcion and his Gospel, and the other to preserve in a complete and comprehensive form some of the older traditions of the Church, which have been in circulation in various forms, particularly in the Gospel of Peter. The Gospel of John was adopted as settling in beautiful language and in an acceptable form the doctrine of the divinity of Jesus and as indicating the unity of the church under Peter. The Gospel of Matthew, in still more explicit language, laid the foundations broad and deep for the establishment of the supremacy of the papal power on the authority of Christ as delegated to Peter. While the Acts of the Apostles bridged over the differences which had so long existed between the followers of Peter and Paul. While thus much is apparent upon the surface, if we attempt to go deeper into the subject, we find everything involved in mystery. All the most reliable sources of information are closed to the researches of the historian. Those writings of the 2nd century to which he would naturally turn for information, commentaries and works written especially concerning the Gospels then in circulation, are lost or destroyed without a single exception. Not one remains to give its testimony on one side or the other of any controverted question. Also, many books written on the same subject during the next 200 or 300 years, while it is notorious that others which have been preserved have been tampered with and extensively interpolated. Loss or destruction of evidence concerning the 4 Gospels. The following is some of the evidence of the 2nd century which has disappeared. 1. The commentaries of Basilides, A.D. 125. Basilides is said to have written a commentary on the Gospel in 24 books. A Gospel is also attributed to him, but the better opinion appears to be that the commentaries and the Gospel were one and the same. These commentaries must have thrown a flood of light upon the history of the Gospels then in existence. They would at least disclose the number and character of the principal ones then in circulation. 2. Agrippa Castor, A.D. 130, wrote in refutation of the heresies of Basilides. This has perished with the commentaries of his adversary. 3. The works of Prodicus, A.D. 120. The followers of Prodicus boasted of having the secret books of Zoroaster. His writings would probably have disclosed the connection between Persian mythology and the Gospels of the infancy. 4. Apologies of Quadratus and Aristides, A.D. 126. If these had been preserved, we could test the correctness of the assertion of Eusebius that the Apology of Quadratus referred to the miracles of Christ, which in that case would be, so far as known, the first reference to them in history. We would know also what is meant by the statement of the same historian, if there be any truth in it at all, that Quadratus and others at that time delivered to those who had not heard the faith the books of the Holy Gospels. We would probably learn from their writings what Gospels were extant in their day. 5. Ariston, A.D. 130. According to Papias, as coming through Eusebius, preserved traditions concerning Christ. These traditions would have thrown much light upon the gospel history and upon the earlier gospels. 6. John the Presbyter, A.D. 130. John, like Ariston, appears in Eusebius as one of the informants of Papias, particularly concerning certain writings composed by Mark and Matthew, information which was long supposed to relate to the Gospels bearing those names. It is now thought they cannot be regarded as referring to any of the canonical Gospels. Had we the original traditions or statements in full, they would at once settle the question. 7. Cerinthus, A.D. 145, was the reputed author of a Gospel. His Gospel and writings are lost or destroyed. 8. Valentinus, A.D. 150. Valentinus had a gospel called the Gospel of Truth. Irenaeus places it sharply in antagonism with the 4 Gospels, says they are false if that of Valentinus was the Gospel of Truth, that if they are true, Valentinus was false. As the work of Irenaeus is preserved and the 4 Gospels, it is much to be regretted and must be considered calamitous to the cause of impartial investigation that we have not the gospel of Valentinus and his writings to support it. 9. Papias. How do you say that? Papias? Papias. It's not it either. Whatever. I can't say it though. Papias. Papias. AD 125. Is said to have written 5 books entitled Exposition of the Oracles of the Lord. This must have been a commentary on the oracles or collections of the sayings of Christ and would have been invaluable, giving those sayings as they stood early in the 2nd century. 10. The writings of Marcion. Pure Christianity has suffered no greater loss than that of the writings of Marcion, the great theological thinker of the 2nd century, the compiler of the first complete gospel, the collector of the epistles of Paul, the editor and publisher of the first New Testament. While the elaborate work against him, written by Tertullian, who called him a hound, has been preserved, and the work of Epiphanius, who bestowed upon him the euphonious appellation of beast, the writings of Marcion have perished, except such as are found in the references and citations of his adversaries. His works have shared the common fate of the writings of the heretics of the 2nd century, none of which in their original form have been permitted to come down to us. Marcion was an educated man and a profound thinker, and no relic of Christian antiquity next to the epistles of Paul would today be more valuable than his writings. Being himself a collector of Gospel and New Testament manuscripts, his writings upon those subjects would forever set at rest the question as to what Gospels were in circulation. 11. The work of Justin Martyr against heresies. As his dialogue with Trypho contains an exposition of the Old Testament, his work against heresies would probably have thrown light upon the Gospels in circulation in his day. It would at least have determined the much controverted question as to the Gospels used by Justin himself. 12. The writings of Apelles, AD 160. Apelles was a Gnostic leader who had a gospel of his own and whose writings must have referred to other gospels. His works are lost or destroyed. 13. Peregrinus, AD about 160. An erratic but talented Christian philosopher, held for a time a commanding position among the Christians of Palestine. Some books, says Lucian, he interpreted and explained, others he wrote. His writings would constitute an important chapter in the history of the times. We have sketches of the man from Lucian, Ammianus, Aulus Gellius, and others, but his writings have all perished. 14. Marcellina, AD 160. It would scarcely be expected that the heretical writings of a woman would be preserved amid such wholesale slaughter of the obnoxious works of the opposite sex. The writings of Marcellina have perished. 15. Montanus, AD 170. Much has been said about Montanism, but we have only such extracts from the works of its founder as his adversaries have chosen to preserve. 16. The writings of Tatian, AD 170. Tatian wrote, it is said, a harmony of the Gospels. Though it is quite evident that he made use of the Gospel of the Hebrews and his work was even known by some under that name, an attempt has been made to connect his harmony with the 4 Gospels on the unsupported and suspicious testimony of Eusebius. He says it was called the Diatessaron, which he explains as meaning of or from the 4. If we had the writings of Tatian himself or his harmony, the question could speedily be determined. 17. Marcus, about AD 170, had, according to Irenaeus, an innumerable multitude of apocryphal writings. He probably wrote in explanation of these books and of their origin, both the books themselves with a few exceptions and whatever he may have written concerning them have perished. It ain't nothing to me. All right. Page 456. 18. Pantius, AD 180. Let me make sure. Okay. Well, it could not be expected that Pantius, if he wrote the Gospel of Matthew, would admit the fact, yet if we had the account of his travels in India and his discovery there as claimed of an original Gospel of Matthew, we might have at least some light thrown upon the origin of that Gospel. 19. The Chronicles of Hegesippus, A.D. 185. Hegesippus was the first church historian. He traveled over nearly all Christendom for the express purpose of obtaining information and then wrote the history of the church from the beginning to his own time. This work is lost or destroyed. The extent of the loss cannot be overestimated. Eusebius was the next historian, writing 140 years afterward. He had the history of Hegesippus before him. After referring to the death of James and the statement of Clement that James was thrown from a wing of the temple and beaten to death with a club, he says, Hegesippus also, who flourished nearest the days of the apostles in the 5th book of his commentaries, gives the most accurate account of him thus. Here follows a lengthy account of the death of James. Eusebius then adds, such is the more ample testimony of Hegesippus, in which he fully coincides with Clement. Again, Eusebius gives an account of the grandchildren of Judas, called the Lord's brother, who were examined before the Emperor Domitian. He concludes as follows, such is the statement of Hegesippus. Again, speaking of the martyrdom of Simon, 2nd Bishop of Jerusalem, he says, to this the same Hegesippus bears testimony, whose words we have already so often quoted. He then quotes several passages further from the same author. Subsequently referring to classical writers, he says, among these, Hegesippus holds a distinguished rank, many of whose writings we have already quoted, where we have given some things as he has delivered them from apostolic tradition. This author compiled in 5 books the plain tradition of the apostolic doctrine in a most simple style of composition, and clearly shows the time in which he lived, where he writes respecting those who began to erect idols, etc. Here follows a quotation from Hegesippus concerning the erection of cenotaphs, temples, etc. Again, in the same book, he says, Hegesippus, indeed, in the 5 books of commentaries that have come down to us, has left a most complete record of his own views. In these, he states that he conversed with most of the bishops when he traveled to Rome, and that he received the same doctrine from all. We may also add what he says after some observations on the epistle of Clement to the Corinthians. He then quotes Hegesippus concerning the church of Corinth. Continuing, Eusebius speaks of Hegesippus coming to Rome and of the Roman bishops, and Anicetus, Soter, and Eleutherus in every succession. However, says Hegesippus, and in every city the doctrine prevails according to what is declared by the law and the prophet and the Lord. He then quotes what Hegesippus says concerning the beginning of heresies and the ancient heresies prevalent among the Jews. He also speaks of many other matters, says Eusebius, which we have in part already quoted and introduced in their appropriate places. He also states some particulars from the Gospel of Hebrews and from the Sirach, and particularly from the Hebrew language, showing that he himself was a convert from the Hebrews. Other matters he also records is taken from the unwritten tradition of the Jews. And not only he, but Irenaeus also, and the whole body of the ancients, called the Proverbs of Solomon wisdom, comprehending every virtue. Also, in discoursing on the books called apocryphal, he relates that some of them were forged in his day by some of the heretics. From the foregoing, it will be seen how much of the history of Hegesippus is incorporated into that of Eusebius. A few meager items of comparatively no historical value, the manner of the death of James, the examination of a few individuals before Domitian, the martyrdom of Simon, the worshipping of idols, the journey to Rome, and a few words concerning the commencement of heresies. Not a word of what was important to be known of the history of the progress of the church and of the doctrines which had prevailed, of the controversies between the Jewish and Gentile Christians, of the history of Paul and Peter, and of the founding of the Church of Rome, and above all, of the history of the Gospels and New Testament books which Hegesippus found in circulation, showing by whom they were written and how they had been preserved. So far as can be learned, Hegesippus was profoundly silent concerning the four Gospels and spoke only of the Gospel of the Hebrews. The history of Hegesippus must have been written after the accession of Eleutherus, Bishop of Rome, in probably about AD 185. This was, if we have read history aright, in the infancy of the four Gospels. Whether Hegesippus met with them, and if so, what estimate he formed of them in comparison with the Gospel of the Hebrews, is a question of the utmost importance, but one upon which Eusebius is silent. Since Eusebius had the history of Hegesippus in his possession, why did he not take measures to have it preserved, or else incorporate it into his own history, the most important portions of it, and particularly the evidence, if any, in favor of the four Gospels? According to Eusebius, Hegesippus said that in every city the doctrine prevailed according to the law and the prophets and the Lord, and that he received the same doctrine from all. Eusebius would have his readers believe that the doctrine of a Jewish Christian of the 2nd century was precisely the same as that which prevailed in every city. Again, Eusebius says that Hegesippus derived his information concerning apostolic doctrine from tradition. Is that consistent with the existence of gospels which were everywhere received in the church as authoritative? Such gospels would have been superior to and would have taken the place of all tradition concerning apostolic doctrine. 20. Commentaries of Heraclian, AD 190. It is claimed that Heraclian wrote commentaries on Luke and John. Clement of Alexandria quotes Heraclian in such a way as to indicate that he had commented on Luke or Marcion or on some other gospel containing the sayings of Christ. The commentaries on John are inferred from some passages of Origen. If these commentaries existed, their loss is irreparable. 21. The writings of Serapion, AD 190. These of which we have but a brief extract in Eusebius would have enlightened us further in regard to the transaction at Rosas. From Serapion, we could have learned something of the four Gospels which he was substituting in place of the Gospel of Peter. He could inform us how long the four Gospels had been in circulation, where he obtained them, what other Gospels he had been obliged to suppress to make way for them, and whether he was acting under the direction of the Church of Rome. His writings have perished. 22. Clement of Alexandria. It is said to have composed a work especially upon the scriptures which were considered authoritative. Eusebius says that in the work called Hypotypesis, Clement gave abridged accounts of all the canonical scriptures. This work has perished, while most of the other more important writings of Clement have been preserved. This ends the list of works of the 2nd century, either written expressly concerning the Gospels and New Testament books in circulation at that time, or which would have thrown more or less light upon the subject. More than 50 books by more than 20 authors. Nearly everything written concerning the Gospels to the year 325 and all the copies of the Gospels themselves to the same period are lost or destroyed. All right. 6th period, AD 185 to AD 200, close of the 2nd century. Austerius, Urbanus, Cassianius, Heraclion, Muratorian fragment, Ptolemaeus, Maximilia, Victor, Serpion, Bishop of Antioch, Theodotus of Byzantium, Narcissus, Bishop of Jerusalem, Rhodon, Palmus, Polycrates, Bishop of Ephesus, Maximus, bishop of Jerusalem, Notus, Praxius, Symmachus, Hermas, Seleucus, Pistis Sophia, Artemon, second epistle of Clement, Julius Africanus, Asturius Urbanus, AD 188. Of this writer, but little is known. According to Cave, he flourished about the year 188. Cassianus, AD 190, Julius Cassianus was a writer of the 2nd century who was quoted by Clemens Alexandrinus thus: "Wherefore Cassianus saith, that when Salome asked Christ when the things should be known concerning which she inquired, our Lord answered, when you shall despise," etc., which Clement adds was to be found in the Gospel according to the Egyptians, from which it is to be inferred that Cassianus made use of that Gospel. Ptolemus Herculean, AD 190. These were prominent Gnostics. Ptolemus wrote a letter to Flora, which occupies a distinguished place in the literary history of the times. In this letter, Ptolemy, having commented upon the ceremonial and typical laws of the Pentateuch as having been annulled by the appearing of the truth, adds: "These things the other disciples of Christ taught, and also the Apostle Paul," after which he tells Flora that he will explain to her the particulars of the doctrine he had just been mentioning by the help of tradition received from the apostles and handed down to them. But he adds, all must be tried by and made to square with the doctrine of the Savior himself, which was to be the rule. Heraclion is quoted by Clement and Origen and is said to have written commentaries on Luke and John. This again is denied by some critics. Origen shows that Heraclion made use of the Gospel of Peter. The Muratorian fragment, about AD 190. Nothing could better illustrate the paucity of materials from which to make up a correct judgment concerning the New Testament writings of 2nd century than the prominence which has been given to an anonymous manuscript discovered in the last century by an Italian scholar, Muratori. This celebrated manuscript was found in the Ambrosian Library at Milan in a manuscript containing other writings of little importance. It speaks of the 3rd book of the Gospel according to Luke, of the 4th of the Gospels, of John, 1 of the disciples, of the Acts of the Apostles, 13 epistles of Paul, an epistle to the Laodiceans, and another to the Alexandrians, supposed to be the epistle to the Hebrews, forged in the name of Paul after the heresy of Marcion, and many others which cannot be received by the Catholic Church, as gall must not be mixed with vinegar. The Epistle of Jude and the 2nd and 3rd epistles of John are spoken of doubtfully as among the received books, so also the Book of Wisdom. The Apocalypses of John and Peter were received, but some objected to reading in the church the Apocalypse of Peter. Special reference is made to the pastor of Hermas, the writer thinking it should be read privately, but not publicly in the church. It will be seen that the document exhibits a very confused condition of the canon. The manuscript was estimated by Moriarty himself to be about 1,000 years old. It bears internal evidence of being a transcript of an older document. How often it has been copied cannot be known, nor even in what language it was originally written. It appears in Latin, and the text is very corrupt. It is supposed by some to have been written in the latter part of the 2nd century, the supposition being based principally upon the reference to the pastor of Hermas. This, it states, was composed very recently in our own times in the city of Rome, the Bishop Pius, his brother, sitting in the chair of the church of the city of Rome. Pius was bishop about the middle of the 2nd century. There are eminent critics, however, who hold that the original was not written earlier than the 3rd century. Their opinion is based upon internal evidence, particularly the expression sitting in the chair of the church. The document itself, a production of about the 8th century, cannot be looked upon as very satisfactory evidence of the condition of the canon in the 2nd century. Victor Seraphim, Bishop of Antioch, Maximilla, AD 190. We are not aware that any of the writings of these are extant except a fragment or two of Seraphim. Yeah, that's it. They are given by Eusebius and relate to the interdict of the Gospel of Peter and the substitution of the canonical Gospels in its stead. Theodotus of Byzantium, AD 192. A considerable fragment from this writer is given by Clement of Alexandria. Theodotus taught that Christ was a man only. He used and cited the preaching of Peter. He was excommunicated by Victor, Bishop of Rome. Rhodon, Narcissus, Bishop of Jerusalem, AD 195. There is a fragment of Eusebius attributed to Rhodon in which he vindicates the character of Apelles. The same historian relates of Narcissus, Bishop of Jerusalem, that when the oil failed at the vigils of the great watch of Easter, Narcissus commanded that water from a neighboring well should be poured into the lamps, whereupon Narcissus, having prayed over it, the water was changed into oil, of which Eusebius says a specimen had been preserved until that time. The same writer relates that 3 men, having slandered Narcissus and sworn to their falsehoods with imprecations of death upon themselves by a miserable disease, by fire and blindness, respectively, if their statements were not true, in each case the curse which had been invoked was inflicted upon them by an omnipotent providence. Palmus Polycrates, Bishop of Ephesus, AD 196. These bishops were deputed by Victor, Bishop of Rome. What was that? Something beeped. Uh-oh. I hope it's still going. Sorry, I got a thing that said it wasn't going. So hopefully it's still going. If not, it's no big deal. Where was I? Shit. The bishops were deputed by Victor, Bishop of Rome, to convene councils to consider the question of the celebration of Easter. Palmus convened the bishops of Pontus and Polycrates, those of proconsular Asia. The latter refused to endorse the decree of the Italian council, which provided that Easter should be celebrated on Sunday. Thereupon the Asiatic churches were excommunicated. Eusebius says Polycrates wrote a letter to Victor and gives extracts from it. Maximus, Bishop of Jerusalem, AD 200. According to Eusebius, Maximus wrote on the origin of evil and on the creation of matter. A lengthy extract is given by Eusebius. Notice AD 200. About this time, the controversy concerning the nature of Christ was carried on with much spirit by Theodotus, Hermogenes, Notus, Varro, Beryllus, and Sabellius on the one side, and Artemon and Paul of Samosata on the other. Notus was a native of Asia Minor. He maintained that Christ was the one God, both Father and Son. He was excommunicated. The views of Notus led to much discussion, which resulted in the Arian controversy and the establishment of the doctrine of the Trinity. I think it's going. Praxius Symmachus Hermas Seleucus, AD 200. These writers flourished near the close of the 2nd century, but little is known concerning them. Seleucus is reputed to have written a number of the books in circulation in the 2nd century, which were afterwards pronounced apocryphal. There is a strange confusion among the fathers in regard to his name. He is called Seleucus, Lucinus, Lucanus, Lucius, Lucian, Luthon, Lentitus, and Leontius. Also, Lucius Charinus was Seleucus, who had published a version of the Gospel of the Infancy, which rendered it necessary for Jerome to give the bishops a better version. Pistis Sophia, AD 200. This is a religious work of the close of the 2nd century, the author of which is unknown. Second Epistle of Clement, AD 200. It is supposed to have been written about this time, the divinity of Jesus, which was not distinctly taught in the early Clementines, but rather the contrary doctrine. Now more clearly, let me read that again. It is supposed to have been written about this time, the divinity of Jesus, which was not distinctly taught in the early Clementines, but rather the contrary doctrine now more clearly appears. Artemon, Julie Africanus, AD 200. But little is known of Artemon beyond the fact that he was a prominent in the Notian controversy. Africanus was the writer cited by Eusebius in his forgery upon Thales. These names close the list of the more important Christian writers of the first 2 centuries, except the 3 great fathers, who will be briefly noticed in the next chapter. And that's it. Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian. Irenaeus in Gaul, Clement in Egypt, and Tertullian in northern Africa were the 3 fathers by whose influence the 4 Gospels were introduced into general circulation and who laid broad and deep the foundations of Roman Catholic supremacy. It is not easy to form a just estimate of these men. That they were so far above the masses in general intelligence as to give them an immense and controlling influence in the church is certain. While judged by the standard of more enlightened times, they themselves appear at a disadvantage. The Reverend Dr. Davison says of them, Irenaeus was credulous and blundering, Tertullian passionate and one-sided, and Clement of Alexandria imbued with the treasures of Greek wisdom as mainly occupied by ecclesiastical ethics. Again, Irenaeus argues that the gospel should be 4 in number, neither more nor less, because there are 4 universal winds in 4 quarters of the world. Matthew wrote his gospel while Peter and Paul were preaching in Rome and founding the church. Such assertions show both ignorance and exaggeration. Tertullian affirms that the tradition of the apostolic churches guarantees the 4 apostles and refers his readers to the churches of Corinth, Philippi, Ephesus, etc. for the authentic epistles of Paul. What is this but the rhetoric of an enthusiast? Clement contradicts himself in making Peter authorize Mark's gospel to be read in the churches, while in another place he says the apostle neither forbade nor encouraged it. The same writer continues thus: the three fathers of whom we are speaking had neither the ability nor the inclination to examine the genesis of documents surrounded with an apostolic halo. No analysis of their authenticity and genuineness was seriously attempted. In its absence, custom, accident, taste, practical needs directed the tendency of tradition. All the rhetoric employed to throw the value of their testimony as far back as possible, even up to or very near the Apostle John, is of the vaguest sort. Appeals to the continuity of tradition and of church doctrine, to the exceptional veneration of these fathers for the Gospels, to their opinions being formed earlier than the composition of the works in which they are expressed, possesses no force. The ends which the fathers in question had in view, their poetic motives, their uncritical, inconsistent assertions, their want of sure data detract from their testimony. Their decisions were much more the result of pious feeling, biased by the theological speculations of the times, than the conclusions of a sound judgment. The very arguments they use to establish certain conclusions show weakness of perception. What are the manifestations of spiritual feeling compared with the results of logical reasoning? One great work of these fathers was the establishment of the 4 Gospels, which had now appeared and were being introduced into the churches. Immediately connected with this was the establishment of the papal power of a definite basis. Irenaeus, in the 3rd book Against Heresies, written about AD 190, gave the opinion that every church should agree with the Church of Rome on account of its preeminent authority. See the next chapter. About 5 years afterward, he was called upon by the Roman bishop, Victor, to assemble a council of the bishops of Gaul to consider the subject of the celebration of Easter, the question having already been passed upon by a council of Italian bishops. Irenaeus presided in the council, and the result of its deliberations was the approval of the decree of the Italian council. Other councils were in like manner held throughout the Christian world, and the result, with a single exception, was everywhere the same. The movement was to furnish a precedent for the jurisdiction of the Church of Rome over all questions of the kind. It will be seen in the next chapter that the views of Tertullian concerning the preeminence of the Roman Church were, notwithstanding his difference with some of the Roman bishops, scarcely less decided than those of Irenaeus. As to Clement, he is less explicit in the assertion of any supremacy of the Roman Church, but there is little room to doubt that there existed an understanding among these fathers and a concert of action in upholding the establishing at the same time the 4 Gospels and the authority of the Roman bishop. Irenaeus was Bishop of Lyons. He was born, according to Dodwell, in the year 97. According to Dr. Grabe, AD 108, Tilmont about 120, Dupin about 140. The last is probably the nearest correct. About the year 178, he was sent by the Church of Lyons to Eleutherus, Bishop of Rome, with an epistle describing the sufferings during the persecution under Marcus Aurelius. On his return, he was elected Bishop of Lyons in the year 180. He is supposed to have been martyred about AD 202. His martyrdom is denied by some critics. Clement of Alexandria was born either at Athens or Alexandria about the year 160. From 190 to 202, he presided over the catechetic school at Alexandria. In the latter year, he was compelled to leave that city by the persecution under Severus. It is supposed by some that he returned AD 211. His return is doubted by others. He died about the year 220. Tertullian was the first Latin father whose works have been preserved. He was born at Carthage about the middle of the 2nd century and lived to a very advanced age. He was converted about the year 185 and was married the year afterward. He admitted to the priesthood in 192, became a Montanist in 199, and died about 220. He was a vigorous and at times powerful writer, but his works abound in looseness of argument and in whimsical applications of Scripture, such as were common in that day. All right. Chapter 38. The Roman Catholic Hierarchy. It was during the sixth period that the foundations were laid of that great ecclesiastical power which dominated the Christian world for 1,300 years, and whose supremacy is still acknowledged throughout a large part of Christendom. For more than 100 years after the foundation of the Church of Rome, there was no trace of its jurisdiction over other churches outside of the Italian provinces. In the latter part of the 2nd century, a dispute existed concerning the celebration of Easter. The Latin churches claimed it should be on Sunday. The Eastern churches have been celebrating it on the 14th of the month Nisan. The controversy had lasted nearly half a century. About AD 150, Polycarp, Bishop of Smyrna, visited Rome and explained the views of the Eastern churches. He was treated by Anicetus, who was the then bishop, as an equal. No attempt was then made to impose a different day upon the Asiatic churches. On the contrary, Polycarp and others celebrated Easter according to their own views in the city of Rome. But in the time of Victor, the controversy becoming more heated, an attempt was made to settle it. A council was first called by Victor of all the churches of Italy. At this council, it was decreed that Easter should be celebrated on Sunday. Victor then issued a general letter requesting local councils to be assembled by the following bishops: Theophilus of Caesarea, Irenaeus of Lyons, Bacchalius of Corinth, Demetrius of Alexandria, Palamas of Pontus, and Polycrates of Ephesus. The local councils were held. One consisted of the bishops of Gaul, another of those of Palestine, another in Egypt, etc. All these approved the decree of the Italian council, except the churches of Proconsular Asia, presided over by Polycrates. These refused to conform. Thereupon Victor, encouraged and strengthened by all the other councils, proceeded to excommunicate the non-conforming Asiatic churches. This appears to be the first assumption of supreme power by any Roman bishop. From this time, the supremacy of the Church of Rome rapidly culminated, both in theory and practice. It is true that for a long time some churches remained rebellious, but they were considered by the great body of Christians as without the pale of the Church Universal, as it had been established by Christ and had been represented by a regular succession of supreme pontiffs, commencing with Peter. For as soon as the supremacy of the Roman Church was once admitted, the Christians of that day found no difficulty in believing that such supremacy had continued from the times of the apostles. They were no more disposed to trace back the title of a power which they found established than they were to investigate the origin of books which they found in circulation. Protestant writers have claimed that the power of the papacy was not established, nor its claims admitted in the writings of the fathers, until several hundred years after Christ. Even the fair-minded Neander does not see in the writings of Irenaeus or Tertullian any acknowledgement that the Roman Church held a prominence as the cathedra Petri over all the other apostolic churches. Whether as cathedra Petri or as the Church of Peter and Paul, not only the prominence but the supremacy of the Church of Rome would seem to be pretty clear acknowledged in the following passage from Irenaeus. Since, however, it would be very tedious in such a volume as this to reckon up the successions of all the churches, we do put to confusion all these We do put to confusion all those who, in whatever manner, whether by an evil self-pleasing, by vainglory, or by blindness and perverse opinion, assemble in unauthorized meetings. We do this by indicating that tradition derived from the apostles of the very great, the very ancient, and universally known church, founded and organized at Rome by the two most glorious apostles, Peter and Paul, as also by pointing out the faith preached to men, which comes down to our times by means of the successions of the bishops. For it is a matter of necessity that every church should agree with this church on account of its preeminent authority, that is, the faithful everywhere, inasmuch as the apostolic tradition has been preserved continually by those who exist everywhere. The blessed apostles, then, having founded and built up the church, committed into the hands of Linus the office of the episcopate. Of this Linus Paul makes mention of the epistles of Timothy. To him succeeded Anacletus, and after him, in the third place from the apostles, Clement was allotted the bishopric. He then gives the names of 9 bishops following Clement and proceeds as follows. In this order and by this succession, the ecclesiastical tradition from the apostles and the preaching of the church have come down to us, and this is most abundant proof that there is one and the same vivifying faith which has been preserved in the church from the apostles until now and handed down in truth. In the time of Tertullian, some 20 years later, the Roman bishops issued peremptory edicts and appealed to the authority of their predecessors. They called themselves bishops of bishops, episcopi Escaporium. Tertullian himself was scarcely less explicit than Irenaeus, since, moreover, he says, you are close to Italy, you have Rome, from which there comes even into our hands the very authority. How happy is its church, in which apostles poured forth all their doctrine along with their blood, where Peter endures a passion like his Lord's, where Paul wins his crown in the death like John's, where the apostle John was first plunged unhurt into boiling oil and thus remitted to his island exile. See what she has learned, what she has taught, what fellowship she has had, even with churches in Africa. O Lord God, does she acknowledge the Creator of the universe and the Christ Jesus of the Virgin Mary, the Son of God, the Creator and the resurrection of the flesh? The law and the prophets she unites in one volume with the writings of the evangelists, and apostles, from which she drinks her faith, and this she seals with the water, arrays with the Holy Ghost, feeds with the Eucharist, cheers with martyrdom, and against such discipline, thus she admits no gainsayer. This passage is evidence not only of the supremacy of the Roman Church, but that the New Testament then in circulation had been compiled under the same authority. The New Testament of Marcion, consisting of the Gospel and the Apostolicion, had been superseded by a larger collection containing the Acts of the Apostles, the Revelation of John, a larger number of epistles of Paul, and in place of the one Gospel of Marcion, 4 Gospels, which were to stand as 4 pillars to support the authority of the Church of Rome. Irenaeus, while he clearly concedes the supremacy of that church, at the same time shows the weakness of the foundation upon which the supremacy rested. He declares that the church had been founded by Peter and Paul, and that the episcopacy had been by them committed into the hands of Linus. From Linus it had gone to Anacletus, and after him, in the third place from the apostles, Clement was allotted the bishopric. The tradition of the church, Catholic Church, has been that Peter was the first bishop of Rome and that the keys of the kingdom as well as the bishopric were delivered immediately by Peter of Clement. This tradition is in accordance with the letter from Clement to James, which was in circulation at an early day, but it is not sustained by Irenaeus. This discrepancy has been the occasion of much discussion. The most ingenious explanation is given by Rufinus, the Latin translator of the recognitions. Hold on. He conjectures that Linus and Anacletus merely assisted Peter in the management of the church, which was still at the death of Peter, and delivered over to Clement. But then what becomes of the continuous succession dwelt upon by Irenaeus, in the chain of which two of the links consisted of a Linus and an Anacletus? The difficulty does not end here. According to Irenaeus, the next bishop of Clement was Evaristus, but this succession, though accepted by some Catholic writers, is found by others not to accord with the traditions of the Church. Accordingly, the Roman almanac entitled Graecae Catholica interposes Anacletus between Clement and Evaristus. The third bishop, the second exclusive of Peter, according to this authority, was Cletus instead of Anacletus, while Anacletus came after Clement and ruled over the church 12 years, from AD 100 to 112. Darus, the Catholic historian whose work received the endorsement of Pope Pius IX, has followed the succession as given by Irenaeus, stating that his chronology is that of the chronology of l'histoire ecclesiastique, on the model of the great work of President Henault on the history of France. But this author does not agree with Catholic authorities. He has the bishopric of Peter commence in the year 33, fixing the very day, the 29th of June. This is 9 years earlier than the time given in the Almanac, which on this point is supported by Alzog's Handbuch der Kirchenschnitt, a book very extensively used, therefore, among Catholics as a textbook of church history. Cletus, whose bishopric, according to the Roman Almanac, ends in 90, rules a year longer, according to Darius, his bishopric ending AD 91. Then comes Clement, his office terminating, according to both, in the year 100 after him, Evaristus until 109, according to Darus, but according to the Almanac until 121. Then Alexander, his bishopric, according to Alzog and Darius, ending in the year 119, but according to the Almanac in the year 132. After Alexander, the succession of the pontificates was as follows, according to these three authorities. And what I'll do is I'll show you this page a little bit, and then we'll come over here, and you can look at it a little longer, and then I'm going to continue reading. Thus, in these 8 pontificates, there are but 2 points in which any 2 of the 3 authors agree: the commencement of the bishoprics of Sixtus and Pius. In these particulars, Darius agrees with the handbook. But the handbook and almanac do not agree in a single date, neither does Darus agree with the almanac in a single date. Darus and the handbook give the names of 14 bishops previous to the year 200. The almanac gives 15. If Irenaeus be brought into the comparison, while he does not give the dates of the pontificates, he differs from all these authorities in neglecting to say that Peter was bishop of Rome at all. On the contrary, he states that the church was founded by Peter and Paul, and by them handed over to Linus. If during all this time the bishops of Rome had exercised supreme jurisdiction, can it be possible that nowhere throughout the Christian world there would have been kept a record of so much importance as the succession of the supreme bishops? Would it not have been possible to arrive at a more harmonious result than this? It will have been observed that the Roman Catholic Church was established about the same time that the four Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles were brought into general circulation. When Serapion, Bishop of Antioch, in the year 190 put aside the Gospel of Peter and substituted in its stead the four Gospels, he was engaged in the unification of the Church. And it is a significant fact that Irenaeus, the first writer who mentions the four Gospels, was the first to acknowledge the supremacy of the Church of Rome. Review of the Sixth Period, testimony of heathen writers, general review, conclusion. Review of the Sixth Period. 1. The termination of the Sixth Period, which closes the century, finds the four Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles coming into general circulation with most of the other New Testament writings. The condition of the Church in reference to the New Testament books at the time is well summed up by Reverend Dr. Davidson in the closing paragraphs of his 2 volumes of Introduction to the New Testament. The following propositions, says he, are deducible from an impartial survey of the history of the first 2 centuries. The propositions condensed are as follows. 1. Before AD 170, no book of the New Testament was termed Scripture. 2. No certain trace of the existence of the fourth Gospel till after Justin Martyr. This proposition might, with equal truth, be applied to the Synoptic Gospels in their present form. 3. The Gospels of Matthew and Mark cannot be identified with the logia of Matthew and the things said and done by Jesus, which Mark wrote, mentioned by Papias. 4. The writings of Paul were either not used or little regarded by the prominent ecclesiastical writers of the first half of the 2nd century. After AD 150, they began to be valued. 5. The present Gospels did not assume a canonical position till the later half of the 2nd century. 6. No canon of the New Testament, i.e., no collection of New Testament literature like the present one supposed to possess divine authority, existed before AD 200. Davidson's Introduction to the New Testament, Volume 2, page 520. The last proposition cannot be accepted without some hesitation. The reader will remember the words of Tertullian written about the year 200. The law of the prophets, the Church of Rome, unites in one volume with the writings of evangelists and apostles, etc. There is reason to believe that very soon after the four Gospels appeared, somewhere between the years 180 and 200, they were published under the authority and by the direction of the Church of Rome in a volume with the Old Testament and with the other New Testament books in circulation. 2. Closely following the introduction into general circulation of the books mentioned was the establishment of the supremacy of the Bishop of Rome over the entire Catholic Church, the Gospels of John and Matthew being used as powerful agencies in the consummation of that object. Not that the Gospels were considered of higher authority than the traditions of the Church, but those traditions themselves were established upon the firmest foundation by the sanction of Gospels bearing the names of 2 of the apostles of Jesus. And here it is worthy of remark that while in the earlier Gospels attributed to Luke and Mark, neither of whom was an apostle, had been recorded the older legends and traditions of the churches, when, to aid the Bishop of Rome in assuming authority over the entire Christian world, it was thought necessary to have still other Gospels. They were both attributed to apostles of Christ. Heathen writers. Something is said in almost every complete work on the canon concerning the evidence of heathen writers. Such evidence is absolutely of no value in reference to the canon, because no mention is found in any heathen writer of any of the Christian writings before they were referred to by the Christians themselves. Celsus, who, as quoted by Origen, is perhaps most relied upon as referring to the New Testament books, does not appear to have written the work cited by Origen, the true word, until early in the 3rd century. There is, however, important evidence concerning the life and death of Jesus at the time claimed by the Christians, facts which have been disputed by some learned writers. General review, conclusion. In taking a general review of the first 170 years of the Christian religion, the first thing that strikes the mind is the dearth of material from which to construct a reliable history. It is seen at once how much must rest upon probability in its different degrees, how much must be regulated relegated to the province of speculation. The works of the only church historian who wrote during that period lost or destroyed, the few fragments that are left being of comparatively little value, the writings of Porphyry and others who wrote against Christianity, and those of the heretic Christians, all destroyed. There remain only the works of some of the Orthodox fathers and the text of those in a mutilated and corrupted condition. As from a few bones the scientist can reconstruct the entire anatomy, so from these fragments can the historian arrive at the framework of the Orthodox religion of the 2nd century. But the complete and living form of Christianity is wanting. With the exception of the Epistle of Clement of Rome, written near the close of the 1st century, and a few scattering writings afterward, there is but little in the fathers of that day to remind one of the teachings of Jesus or the fervid utterances of the apostle to the Gentiles. The fathers of the 2nd century were, with united energies, engaged in the work of suppressing heresy. Justin Martyr was writing against the Jews, Tertullian against Marcion, and Irenaeus against all the heretics. This raid against those who differed from the established faith left but little time to cultivate the more kindly Christian graces, and finally culminated in the establishment of a power which should be competent for the suppression of heresy by force. The teachings of Paul concerning heresy and his bitter denunciation of heretics contributed largely to this result. Another thing that strikes the attention in a comprehensive review of the period is the ignorance and superstition even of the most enlightened and best educated of the fathers. Their bigotry has been noticed, their ignorance and superstition were no less. With rare exception, they were men who utterly despised that learning of the heathen which consisted in attempts to ascertain the laws of the material universe, construing in the narrowest and strictest sense the maxim that the wisdom of his world is foolish with God. They confined themselves almost exclusively to an exposition of the Jewish scriptures and of the sayings of Christ construed in the light of those scriptures, drawing oftentimes in the application of the prophecies the most fanciful and whimsical analogies. Their credulity was unbounded. They had a sublime disregard for truth, not so much from perversity as from carelessness and indifference to its sacred character. Their unscrupulousness when seeking for arguments to enforce their positions is notorious, as well as the prevalence among them of what are known as pious frauds. Jones, himself a zealous Christian writer, says that Justin Martyr, Clemens Alexandrinus, and Lactinius made use of testimonies out of forgeries and spurious books to prove the very foundation of the Christian revelation, and it is believed on good grounds that Irenaeus was no better. This father, while engaged in the introduction of Gospels, which show that the ministry of Christ lasted from 1 to 3 years, not longer than 3.5, himself declares that it lasted about 20 years, and that he had the tradition from the elders of Asia, who had obtained it from John and the other apostles. Such is the material at the hands of the historian. Of course, he cannot rely implicitly upon the unsupported assertion of any such writer for the truth of any historical fact whatever. When every instance he is obliged to scrutinize carefully and endeavor to ascertain whether any ulterior motives may have prompted whatever statement may be under consideration. If he can find none, and the fact stands uncontradicted by other writers, it is cautiously accepted. Under such circumstances, progress is slow and uncertain. The most that any writer can hope to accomplish is to place in proper shape what is already known and to establish here and there a landmark for the benefit of subsequent historians. In conclusion, as the result of this investigation, it may be repeated that no evidence is found of the existence in the 1st century of either of the following doctrines: the Immaculate Conception, the miracles of Christ, his material resurrection. No one of these doctrines is to be found in the epistles of the New Testament, nor have we been able to find them in any other writings of the 1st century. As to the 4 Gospels, in coming to the conclusion that they were not written in the 1st century, we have but recorded the conviction of the more advanced scholars of the present day, irrespective of their religious views in other respects, with whom the question as now presented is, how early in the 2nd century were they composed? disregarding as inventions of the 2nd century, having no historical foundation, the 3 doctrines above named, and much else which must necessarily stand or fall with them, what remains of the Christian religion. All that is of any value. All that is of any value. All that is in harmony with the immutable laws of the universe, all that is accord with the eternal principles of right and justice still remains. All else is fast pacing away and is destined to pass away forever. All right, that's it.